They are a modern obsession, these Anunnaki. Flick through late-night documentaries or the stranger corners of the internet, and you'll hear the whispers, gods from the sky, or ancient aliens, beings who descended from the heavens in fiery chariots to mine our gold and engineer our very DNA. It's a compelling, almost sci-fi narrative, one that casts humanity as a grand experiment by celestial visitors. But before we get carried away with gold-mining astronauts and genetic engineering, it might be calming and certainly more fascinating to drift back to the source, to peel back the layers of modern speculation and find the original story written in the wet clay of a world that was, for its time, the entire known universe. What did the people of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians actually believe about their gods? Their story is far stranger, far more human, and infinitely more poetic than any tale of extraterrestrials. It begins not with a spaceship, but with water. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we begin this journey back to the dawn of everything, feel free to post your location and local time in the comments below. It's always a quiet thrill to see where in the world people are settling in for a story. Now, let the world outside fade away. Before there was sky, before there was dry land, before the very concept of a name existed for these things, there was only a mixture, a formless, indistinct, and silent swirling of cosmic waters. Imagine an infinite ocean under a starless, lightless, non-existent sky. There was no up, no down, no beginning, and no end. There was only the quiet sloshing of potential. Within this totality were two principles, two primordial beings who were less like people and more like states of existence. There was Apsu, the sweet, fresh water that pools deep beneath the earth. And there was Tiamat, the churning, bitter salt water of the vast and chaotic sea. For an eternity that cannot be measured in years, they simply were, their waters mingling in a lazy, silent embrace. Nothing happened because there was no time for it to happen in. But even in perfect silence, creation stirs. From their commingling, something new emerged. The first gods were born, though they were as indistinct as their parents. Lahmu and Lahamu, beings of silt and mud perhaps, the first separation of substance from the water. They existed for eons, and from them came Anshar and Kishar, who represented the celestial and terrestrial horizons, the first great circular boundaries that began to give the formless cosmos a shape. And from them, in turn, came Anu, the god of the high heavens, a vast and distant sky father. Anu then fathered an equal, a son who would become one of the most important figures in the entire pantheon, the god known as Nudimmud to the Sumerians, but more famously as Ea to the Babylonians, or Enki. Enki was cleverness itself. He was the god of wisdom, of magic, and of the very same life-giving fresh water that formed his great-grandfather as Apsu. With this new generation, a fundamental shift occurred in the universe. Unlike the static, slumbering Tiamat and Apsu, these new gods were beings of action, of energy, of noise. They moved, they spoke, they created, they danced across the cosmic stage. Their divine laughter and thunderous arguments echoed through the watery abyss. For a universe that had known only the gentle lapping of primordial brine, this was a rude awakening. The old order was disturbed, and none was more disturbed than Apsu. The constant clamor of his descendants grated on his ancient consciousness. He couldn't rest. He couldn't find the perfect, silent stillness that had been his entire existence. Turning to his vizier, Mummu, Apsu complained, his voice like the groaning of subterranean rivers. "Their ways have become grievous to me," he rumbled. "By day I find no relief, nor repose by night. I will destroy, I will wreck their ways, that quiet may be restored." He brought this dark proposal to Tiamat, the Great Mother. He would obliterate their children and grandchildren, returning the universe to its original, silent state. But Tiamat, for all her chaotic nature, was still a mother. She was furious. "What?" she roared, the salt seas churning with her rage. "Should we destroy that which we have brought into being? Their ways are indeed very grievous, but let us bear with them." Apsu, however, would not be swayed. Encouraged by the wicked counsel of his vizier Mummu, the father of the gods resolved to commit the first act of war, a war against his own progeny. Here lies one of history's great open questions. How much of this is pure myth, and how much is political allegory? The epic from which this story comes, the Enuma Elish, wasn't just a bedtime story for the Babylonians. It was a foundational text, recited during the Akitu, their critical 11-day New Year's festival. It was a ritualistic retelling that reinforced the entire structure of their cosmos, and, not coincidentally, the supreme authority of Babylon's patron god, Marduk, who we will meet very soon. The defeat of these older gods might well represent the historical subjugation of older Sumerian city-states and their local deities by the rising power of Babylon. The myth provided a divine precedent for earthly conquest. But the new gods were not without a protector. The wisest of them all, the all-perceiving Enki, learned of his great-grandfather's murderous plot. He, the god of magic, would not meet force with force. He would meet it with cunning. He wove a master spell, a sacred and powerful incantation that he cast out into the waters. The words of power washed over the great Apsu, a lullaby of irresistible potency. A profound slumber fell upon the father of the fresh waters, a sleep so deep it was a kind of death. As Apsu lay inert, Enki moved. He took Apsu's belt, removed his crown, and stripped him of his mantle of radiance, claiming them for himself. He had neutralized the primordial threat without a single blow. He then built his own majestic home upon the tranquil body of the sleeping god, naming his domain the Apsu. It was from this sacred, freshwater place that all wisdom and magic would henceforth flow. He also seized the plotting vizier, Mummu, putting a rope through his nose and making him a captive. In the peace that followed, within the very heart of his new home, Enki and his consort Damkina conceived a son. This was no ordinary god. From the moment of his birth, he was magnificent. The text says his father Enki beheld him and rejoiced. He was perfect in form, awesome in his bearing, with 4 eyes that could see everything, and 4 ears that could hear everything. When he spoke, fire blazed from his mouth. He was taller, stronger, and wiser than any god who had come before. His grandfather, the sky god Anu, doted on him, creating the 4 winds to be his playthings. This was Marduk. A new power had been born into the cosmos, a champion for the new generation. But the quiet would not last. For though Apsu was defeated, the Great Mother Tiamat was still out there, her silent grief slowly, surely, curdling into a universe-shattering rage. The quiet that followed Apsu's defeat was a fragile thing. It was the heavy silence of a house after a terrible argument, thick with unspoken resentment. While Enki and the younger gods celebrated the birth of their new prodigy, Marduk, a different set of gods festered in the shadows. These were the ones who had sided with the old ways, who felt the sting of their father's demise. They saw the boisterous energy of Marduk, playing with the four winds his grandfather Anu had made for him, churning the cosmic waters and stirring up the sediment. They saw this not as youthful exuberance, but as a continuation of the same disrespect that had led to the conflict in the first place. So they went to the Great Mother, Tiamat, who still lay vast and quiet in the salt, dark depths. They prodded at her grief, sharpening it into a weapon. When they slew Apsu, your consort, they hissed, you did not march at his side. You sat quietly. Now this new one, this Marduk, torments us. We can get no rest. Have you forgotten your Apsu? Their words were like venom, and they worked. Tiamat's sorrow began to curdle, transforming into a rage more terrible than Apsu's simple frustration. He had wanted quiet. She wanted vengeance. The primordial mother, the very embodiment of chaotic creation, now turned her immense power toward destruction. She began to prepare for war, and she did so by giving birth to an army of nightmares. She spawned monsters, 11 of them, beings so terrifying they would haunt the Mesopotamian imagination for millennia. She brought forth the Musmahu, a 7-headed serpent, the Ushumgalu, a great dragon, and the Lamu heroes, hairy and bestial. There was the Ugalu, the lion demon, the Uridemu, the mad dog man, and the Gerdablulu, the scorpion man. She filled their bodies with venom instead of blood and cloaked them in an aura of unfaceable terror. At the head of this monstrous host, she placed one of her own sons, the god king. To elevate him, to give him unquestionable authority, she fastened upon his breast the most powerful object in existence, the Tablet of Destinies. This artifact, which we now believe, may have been a set of cylinder seals worn as a pendant, was the ultimate symbol of cosmic authority. Whoever held it could decree fate itself. It was the divine equivalent of holding the universe's source code. She made Kingu her new consort and the commander of all her forces, declaring, "His words shall be supreme." News of this terrifying mobilization spread through the heavens like a shockwave. Enki, the wise god whose spell had so easily dispatched Apsu, was the first to learn of it. He was stunned into inaction, his mind reeling at the sheer scale of Tiamat's fury and the horrors she had unleashed. He went before Anshar, the old god of the horizon, and reported what he had seen, his usual cleverness replaced by pure dread. The gods were in a panic. This was not a grumpy old man they could lull to sleep. This was the raging abyss itself, armed with monsters and led by a general who held destiny in his hands. Anshar, in his desperation, first commanded Enki to face her. "You are the one who provoked this war," he reasoned. "Go and stand before her. Your magic is great. Perhaps you can appease her." But when Enki approached the chaotic army, the sheer, overwhelming aura of Tiamat's rage, the sight of her monstrous children, and the terrible power radiating from Kingu broke his nerve. His courage failed. His magic faltered, and he turned and fled back to the divine assembly in shame. The gods despaired. If their cleverest champion was so easily routed, what hope did they have? Anshar then turned to Anu, the great sky father. Anu was given a scepter and sent to negotiate, but he suffered the same fate. He journeyed to the edge of Tiamat's forces, took one look at her terrible face, and could not bear it. He too turned back, his divine authority utterly useless against such primal fury. The pantheon was paralyzed with fear. Their greatest and wisest had failed. A gloomy silence fell over the gods. No one else dared to step forward. It was then that young Marduk, observing the despair of his elders, came before them. He was not boastful, but his confidence was a stark contrast to their terror. He addressed his father, Enki, and the assembly. "Lord of the gods, destiny of the great gods," he began. "If I am to be your champion, if I am to bind Tiamat and save your lives, then you must grant me something in return." The desperate gods leaned in. What did he want? "Summon a grand assembly," Marduk declared, "and there proclaim for me a supreme destiny. Let my word, instead of yours, determine the fates. Whatever I create shall not be altered. The command of my lips shall not be countermanded or annulled." The terms were breathtakingly audacious. He was not merely offering to be their champion. He was staging a coup. In exchange for saving them, he demanded supreme, absolute, and eternal kingship over all of them. He would become the new Apsu, the new authority, but one born of merit, not of primogeniture. The historical mystery of the Tablet of Destinies is profound. To the Mesopotamians, the written word was magic. A legal contract inscribed on a clay tablet was a binding reality. A medical text could cast out a demon. So a divine tablet that recorded the fates was the most powerful concept imaginable. Its possession conferred legitimacy, which is why it's such a critical element in this story and others, like the myth of the bird god Anzu, who steals the tablet from Enlil. By giving it to Kingu, Tiamat was attempting to establish a new world order based on chaos. For Marduk to win, he wouldn't just have to kill her, he would have to reclaim that legitimate authority, that control over the written fate of the universe. Faced with utter annihilation on one hand and subjugation on the other, the choice for the gods was clear. Anshar, the old patriarch, sent his vizier Kaka to summon the rest of the pantheon, including his own ancient parents, Lahmu and Lahamu. The message was dire. Tiamat, their mother, had rejected them and was raising an army to destroy them all. Their only hope was Marduk, and he had named his price. The gods gathered in the great hall of assembly, greeting each other grimly before sitting down to a feast. But it was a feast of nervous energy, a last supper before their potential doom. They ate bread and drank wine, and the alcohol worked its way through their divine forms, making them drowsy and relaxed. Their fear began to recede, replaced by a drunken confidence in their new champion. In this state of mellow acceptance, they made their decision. They would accept the deal. They would save themselves, and in doing so, forever change the structure of their own universe. They prepared a royal throne for Marduk, and as he sat before them, they began the formal process of ceding their power, of creating a king. In the great hall of the gods, a throne of kingship was set for Marduk. This was no mere coronation. It was a desperate transfer of power, a final gamble. To test the authority they were about to bestow, the gods performed a kind of miracle in reverse. They placed a single constellation, or perhaps a simple garment, in their midst and spoke to their chosen champion. Lord, truly your decree is first among gods. Command to destroy and to create, and it shall be. Open your mouth, the constellation shall be destroyed. Speak again, and it shall be restored. Marduk, seated on his new throne, spoke a single word, and the stars vanished. He spoke another, and they reappeared, whole and perfect. Seeing this, that his command alone could unmake and remake a piece of the cosmos, the gods rejoiced. They chanted Marduk as king, and formally presented him with the scepter, the throne, and the royal robe, granting him dominion over all. Now he had to earn it. Marduk began to prepare for a war against a being of chaos, and so his weapons could not be ordinary. He took no simple sword or spear. He crafted a mighty bow and fletched an arrow, and before him he slung bolts of lightning. He filled his body with a searing flame. He then fashioned a great net, a divine catch-all, and assigned the four winds to hold it at its corners so that nothing could escape. But these were just the conventional winds. He then summoned more, creating winds of pure malevolence to be his vanguard: the evil wind, the whirlwind, the hurricane, the fourfold wind, the sevenfold wind, the cyclone, the unrivaled wind. He mounted his storm chariot, a vehicle of indescribable terror, drawn by four fearsome beasts: the killer, the relentless, the trampler, and the swift, their lips drawn back, their teeth dripping with poison. Clad in an armor of divine radiance, and holding an herb in his lips to neutralize any poison, Marduk rode out, his entire being a perfect, focused storm of divine violence, heading directly for the heart of chaos. As he approached Tiamat's horde, his sheer splendor was a weapon in itself. The monstrous children of chaos faltered, their courage breaking at the sight of the blazing god. Kingu, her chosen general, the one who held the tablet of destinies, was utterly bewildered. His will to fight evaporated. Tiamat herself let out a terrible roar, but it was the sound of an animal cornered, not a confident queen of the abyss. Marduk raised his net, and as she saw it, she screamed and lost her senses, shrieking curses. It was the moment of confrontation. Marduk, unfazed, challenged her directly. "Why have you risen and plotted this war, pitting son against father, and why do you now despise your own children?" He thundered. "You have elevated king to be your consort, an office to which he has no right. You have plotted evil against the gods, my fathers. Let our armies be drawn up. Let us meet in single combat." At this, Tiamat was consumed by a fury so absolute that it overrode all reason. She became chaos incarnate. She opened her mouth, a cavernous maw that was the gate to the abyss itself, intending to swallow the young god whole. But this was precisely the opening Marduk had been waiting for. He drove the evil wind, the Imhulu, straight into her gaping mouth. The wind was so powerful, so immense, that it coursed through her body, distending her stomach and filling her vast form like a sail. She couldn't close her mouth. She couldn't breathe. She was paralyzed, trapped by the storm raging within her. With the great mother of chaos held fast, Marduk raised his bow. He let loose a single arrow. It flew true, tearing through her inflated belly, slicing through her insides, and piercing her heart. The arrow extinguished her life. He stood over her vast, unmoving body. The battle was won, but the war was not over. Her army, seeing their mother and creator slain, broke. They turned to flee, to save their own lives, but there was no escape. Marduk's net, held by the four winds, descended upon them. He captured the entire host of 11 monsters, smashing their weapons and binding them in chains at his feet. The last to be dealt with was their general. He cornered the terrified king, and from his breast he took the tablet of destinies. This was the true moment of victory. It was not just a military conquest, but a legal and cosmic one. He pressed his own sacred seal upon the tablet, claiming its authority as his own, and fastened it securely to his own breast. Order had not just defeated chaos, it had seized the very instrument of universal law. This narrative of Chaos Kampf, the divine struggle against chaos, is a powerful and recurring theme in world mythology. Marduk's fight is not just one god against another. It is the archetype of civilization against the untamed wild. Tiamat is the raging, unpredictable, and destructive sea, the formless chaos that threatens to overwhelm the fragile order of the world. Marduk is the hero god who represents the structures of society, of law, of religion, and of architecture, the very forces that build walls to keep the chaos out and channel its power into something productive. The story affirms that the world is not given, it is made. It is constructed from the raw, dangerous material of its opposite. It's a foundational belief that order is something that must be perpetually won and re-won from the ever-present threat of dissolution. With the tablet of destinies now his, and with Tiamat's monstrous children bound and broken, Marduk returned to the lifeless body of their mother. He placed his foot upon her, a gesture of final dominance. He had defeated the abyss. He had secured his kingship. Now, standing victorious upon the corpse of creation's first mother, he looked down at the sheer, unimaginable scale of her form. A new idea began to dawn in his mind, a thought not of war, but of creation. A plan to build a new cosmos, a stable and orderly home for the gods, using the only raw material available, the body of the enemy he had just slain. With the cosmos cleared of its primordial threats, Marduk, the newly crowned king of the gods, began his great work of architecture. He was no longer a warrior, but a creator, and his raw material was the immense, slain body of Tiamat. He approached her corpse with the careful precision of a master craftsman, splitting her vast form down the middle, clean and straight, as one would split a fish for drying. One half of her ribbed and scaled torso he hoisted up high, bending it into a great arch to form the roof of the heavens. He bolted it fast and stationed guards, giving them a strict and simple command: do not let a single drop of her chaotic salt water leak through. This vaulted sky became the firmament, a barrier between the orderly realm below and the celestial waters above. Within this new celestial sphere, he began to organize time and space. He built stellar stations for the great gods, luminous mansions in the sky which we would recognize as the constellations. He designed the zodiac, defining the shape of the year and assigning the months to their starry patterns. From Tiamat's spittle, he formed the clouds, the wind, and the rain. He then set the moon god, Nana, in the sky, making him the keeper of the night and the marker of days, saying, "At the beginning of the month, glow over the land. You shall have horns to designate 6 days. On the 7th day, the crescent shall be half. He established the celestial home of Anu, Enlil, and Enki, the great Trinity, setting up the cosmic geography of his new kingdom. Then he turned to the other half of Tiamat's body. He laid it out to form the earth, or Setu. From her weeping eyes, he gouged out 2 holes, and from them the 2 life-giving rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, began to flow. He piled mountains upon her head, creating the Zagros and the Taurus ranges that bordered their land. The world was now a place of structure, of purpose, of divine design, all of it built from the tamed and repurposed body of chaos. Marduk then established his own capital as a terrestrial counterpart to the celestial pole, a place called Babylon, meaning gateway of the gods. He built the towering ziggurat, the Esagala, as his personal shrine, a place where the gods could gather. With the world complete, the great Anunnaki gods who populated the heavens, and the Agigi, the lesser gods who dwelled below, came to him. They had a new home, a new king, and a new order. But they also had new responsibilities. The world, like any great machine, required maintenance. Canals needed to be dug, fields needed to be irrigated, and sacrifices needed to be offered to keep the whole system running. And the gods, quite frankly, did not want to work. They were divine beings, meant for feasting, for leisure, for contemplating their own glory, not for manual labor. They had been freed from the terror of Tiamat, only to be shackled by the burden of cosmic chores. Listening to their complaints, Marduk, in his infinite wisdom, conceived of another, even greater creation, a truly ingenious plan. He would create a subordinate, a primitive worker. He called the gods together and announced his intentions. "I shall create a primitive being," he declared, his voice echoing in the grand new halls of Babylon. "Man shall be his name. I will create a savage worker. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease." The gods were delighted. A servant race designed for toil was the perfect solution. But to create such a being, a divine element was needed: blood. Marduk addressed the assembly. "Let one of you be given up who incited Tiamat to rebel. Let him be destroyed, that people may be fashioned." This myth provides a fascinating and rather bleak window into the Mesopotamian worldview. For them, life was often a struggle. The rivers could flood unpredictably, the sun could be scorching, and endless labor was required to produce enough food to survive. This story was not an indictment of that hardship, but an explanation for it. It taught that humanity's lot in life, to toil, to serve, to suffer, was not a punishment or a mistake, but their very reason for being. This worldview created a very practical, almost contractual relationship with the divine. Humans provided the gods with food, drink, and service through temple sacrifices and rituals. In exchange, the gods maintained the order of the world and kept disasters at bay. It was a cosmic employment contract, and humanity was the permanent, unpaid workforce. The gods, gathered in their assembly, did not hesitate. They all pointed to the one who had been Tiamat's commander, the one whose ambition had helped fuel her rage, Kingu. He was dragged before the council. The charges were read against him, and he was found guilty of fomenting war against the gods. He was bound, and before the horrified eyes of his former comrades, his veins were severed, His divine blood, the blood of a traitor and a rebel, poured out. It was then that Enki, the god of craft and wisdom, took this dark, guilty substance, and mixing it with the clay of the earth, he fashioned the very first human being. Lulu, the savage one, was born. Humanity was created, not from a sense of divine love or companionship, but from the executed body of a failed usurper, for the sole purpose of being slaves. The gods imposed upon this new creature the drudgery they had sought to escape. Humanity's destiny was to carry the basket, to till the soil, and to chant the praises of the gods, who were now, finally, at their eternal ease. With their labor problem solved, the gods celebrated their king, bestowing upon Marduk his 50 sacred names, each one representing an aspect of his power and his great deeds. The cosmos was complete, the world was populated, and the gods were at rest. The great cosmic machine was built, and humanity, the Lulu, was put to work. For a time, the plan worked perfectly. The canals were dug, the shrines were maintained, the offerings were made, and the gods, for the first time in their existence, were truly at ease. Humanity, born of a rebel god's blood and clay, proved to be an excellent, if unwitting, servant class. They were fruitful, and they multiplied, spreading across the new lands formed from Tiamat's body. Cities grew, civilization flickered into life, and with it came the constant, unending hum of existence. The sound of hammers on bronze, the chatter of marketplaces, the cries of children, the songs of workers in the fields. This was the sound of life, the sound of success. And for the supreme god, Enlil, it was an intolerable noise. In this telling of the story, one of the oldest we have, it is not the Babylonian Marduk who rules, but the great Sumerian god Enlil, the lord of wind and storm, the god who holds the tablets of destiny. And much like his cosmic ancestor Apsu, Enlil was a being who craved quiet. The constant clamor of the multiplying humans rose up from the earth and disturbed his divine slumber in the heavens. Their noise grated on his nerves. He convened the council of the gods. "The noise of mankind has become too great," he complained. "I am losing sleep." His solution was simple and brutal, a culling. He would thin the herd to lessen the noise, and so he unleashed the plague, a sickness that swept through the human settlements, silent and deadly. But there was a man on earth named Atrahasis, whose name meant exceedingly wise. He was a pious ruler, a good man who understood his place. Crucially, he was a devoted follower of the clever god Enki, humanity's original creator. As his people withered and died, Atrahasis went to the temple of his patron god and wept, begging for guidance. Enki, who had a soft spot for his creation and a long-standing rivalry with the imperious Enlil, heard his prayer. But he couldn't act openly against the king of the gods, so he devised a characteristically cunning plan. He whispered to his faithful servant, "Atrahasis, have your people cease all worship. Make no more offerings to any of the gods, except for one, Namtar, the demon god of the plague. Build a temple for him and lay all your offerings at his door alone." Atrahasis did as he was told. The people of his city directed all their prayers and sacrifices to the plague god. Namtar, who was used to being feared but rarely worshipped, was overwhelmed. He was so flattered and frankly shamed by the lavish, focused attention that he could not, in good conscience, continue to kill the very people who were honoring him so completely. He stayed his hand, The plague lifted. For a time, there was peace, but humanity, being resilient, soon recovered. They multiplied once more, and before long, the din of their existence was just as loud as it had been before. Enlil was furious. His sleep was disturbed again, and his elegant solution had been foiled by some trickery he couldn't quite place. This time, he decided on a new method. He would starve them out. He commanded the sky god Akkad to bolt the doors of the heavens and withhold all rain. He commanded the powers of the earth to let no spring water bubble up. A devastating drought and famine took hold. The fields turned to dust, and the people began to starve. It is a striking fact of history that this story, or one very much like it, is among the oldest ever written down. The Epic of Atrahasis and the even older Sumerian flood myth predate the biblical story of Noah by more than 1,000 years. This suggests that the idea of a great, world-destroying flood, survived by a single hero warned by a sympathetic god, was not an isolated tale, but a foundational myth shared across the ancient Near East. For the people living along the unpredictable and powerful Tigris and Euphrates rivers, catastrophic floods were a terrifyingly real part of life. A single bad season could wipe out cities and turn fertile plains into a muddy sea. These stories were their way of making sense of that reality, of seeing the hand of the gods in the destructive power of nature, and of finding hope in the idea that even in the face of total annihilation, a wise and pious person could be saved. Once again, the wise Atrahasis prayed to his god, Enki, and once again, Enki offered a clever way out. Do as you did before, the god advised, but this time, direct all your worship to Akkad, the god of the storm. Atrahasis obeyed. The people built a temple to the storm god and gave him all their offerings. Akkad, like Namtar before him, was so moved by this exclusive devotion that he was compelled to act. In the dead of night, secretly defying Enlil's command, he let a fine mist of rain fall upon the fields, just enough to bring life back to the grain and end the famine. Enlil's plan had failed a second time. Now, the Lord of the Gods was beyond mere fury. He was incandescent with rage. He had been twice undermined, and he would not allow it to happen a third time. He summoned the entire divine assembly, every last god, and declared his final solution, a great flood, a wall of water to scour the earth clean of humanity and their noise once and for all. And this time, to ensure there would be no more tricks, he made every single god, including his rival Enki, swear a binding, unbreakable oath not to warn any mortal of the coming doom. Enki was trapped. He had sworn the oath. He could not speak to Atrahasis. But the god of wisdom was a master of loopholes. He went down to the riverbank where Atrahasis lived in his house of woven reeds. He did not enter. He did not call for his servant. He stood outside and spoke, not to the man, but to the house itself. Reed hut, wall, wall, he proclaimed to the inanimate object. Reed hut, hear me. Wall, understand. Dismantle your house and build a boat. Spurn possessions and save your life. Build a great boat. Make it strong and seal it with bitumen. Take aboard the seed of all living things. Inside, Atrahasis heard everything. He understood the message, the warning, and the desperate cleverness of his god. The oath was not broken, and the exceedingly wise man knew what he had to do. Atrahasis, his mind reeling from the disembodied voice of his god, knew he had no time to waste. He went before the elders of his city, his face a mask of solemn duty, and told them the clever lie Enki had provided. "My people," he announced, "I can no longer live among you. The great god Enlil is filled with a terrible anger for me, for I am a follower of his rival, the lord Enki. I cannot stay in Enlil's land. I must go down to the Apsu, the great abyss, to dwell with my master Enki. From there, he will bless you with a bounty of fish and birds." The lie was perfect, playing on their understanding of divine politics. Believing their king's departure would appease the angry sky god and bring them prosperity, the people of the city did not shun him. They lamented his leaving, but they pitched in to help, their own hands working to build the very instrument of their destruction. The boat was built in 7 days, a great round coracle, reinforced with ribs of wood and sealed watertight inside and out with thick layers of bitumen. Atrahasis then began to load his cargo. He brought aboard his family, the craftsmen who had helped him build, and all his gold and silver. And then, as the animals of the steppe gathered around the strange vessel, he took aboard the seed of all living things. He sealed the final door just as the weather began to turn. The storm that broke was not a natural one. It was a coordinated divine assault. Akkad, the storm god whose favor Atrahasis had so recently courted, now roared from the sky, his thunder shaking the foundations of the world. Nergal, the lord of the underworld, tore out the posts of the celestial dams, allowing the waters of the abyss to surge upwards. Ninurta, the god of war and floods, raced through the land, unleashing the deluge. The world was plunged into a darkness so complete that the gods could not see one another. The roar of the water was the only sound in the cosmos. This was the work of the Anunnaki, the great gods who sat as a divine council and ruled the universe. And for a moment, let us pause and consider who they were, these beings of such casual, terrifying power. At the very top sat the Great Trinity. There was Anu, the Sky Father, the original patriarch from whom most other gods descended. He was a remote figure, a sort of divine chairman of the board, dwelling in the highest heaven. His authority was immense, but rarely exercised directly, representing the unchanging, eternal order of the stars. Below him, and far more active in the world, was his son, Enlil. He was the king, the lord of wind, air, and earth, the god who resided in his great temple at Nippur, and who held the tablet of destinies. He was the enforcer, the one who demanded order, and as humanity just discovered, the one whose sleep must never, ever be disturbed. He embodied the raw, untamed, and often brutal power of nature itself. And then there was Enki, the lord of wisdom, magic, and the life-giving fresh waters of the Apsu. He was the craftsman of the gods, the trickster, the one who thought his way around problems rather than meeting them with force. He was the great civilizer and humanity's often frustrated protector, forever trying to soften the harsh decrees of his brother Enlil. These three formed the axis around which the Mesopotamian cosmos turned. The structure of their divine society, unsurprisingly, mirrored the human world. It was a complex hierarchy. The Anunnaki were the great gods, the seven who decreed the fates, including the main trinity, along with others like the moon god Nana and the sun god Utu. Below them were the Agigi, the lesser sky gods, who had once been forced to do the manual labor of the universe before humanity was created to relieve them of that burden. Each god had a role, a home city, and a personality. They had families, and most importantly, they had rivalries. Their divine society was just as political and prone to squabbling as any human court. As the floodwaters rose, this divine society began to crumble. Even the gods who had ordered the destruction were horrified by its sheer scale. The Anunnaki, the great gods, were parched with thirst, their celestial feasts forgotten. Ishtar, the powerful goddess of love and war, the queen of heaven, whom we also know as Inanna, looked down at the devastation and let out a piercing shriek. "How could I have commanded such a evil in the assembly of the gods?" she cried, her voice filled with anguish. "To destroy my people, the ones I myself gave birth to. They are now like dragonflies filling the sea." Her regret was echoed by the others. The gods who had so confidently condemned humanity to death were now consumed by fear. The deluge they had unleashed was so violent, so total, that it terrified them. They fled the earth, ascending to the highest heaven of Anu. But even there, they found no comfort. They did not sit in council. They cowered outside the gates, huddled together against the celestial wall like wet and beaten dogs, whimpering in terror at the storm they had made. For 6 days and 7 nights, the wind and the floodwaters raged, and the gods of heaven wept, their divine authority utterly meaningless in the face of the primordial chaos they had reawakened. On the 7th day, the storm finally exhausted its fury. The winds fell silent, the deluge ceased, and the sea grew calm. Atrahasis, who had been sealed in the rocking darkness of his vessel, opened a hatch and let the light fall upon his face. He looked out upon a silent, devastated world. The landscape was a flat, unending sheet of brown water, and where there had once been cities and fields teeming with his people, there was nothing. As the text grimly states, all of humanity had been turned back to clay. He wept at the sight, tears streaming down his cheeks. His boat, pushed by the receding waters, came to rest upon the peak of a mountain, and there it held fast. After waiting another 7 days for the waters to recede further, he opened the doors and released the animals. Then he stepped out onto the wet, new earth and did what he was created to do. He served the gods. He set up an offering, arranging 7 and 7 ritual vessels, and into them he heaped sweet cane, cedar, and myrtle, setting them ablaze to send a plume of sweet-smelling smoke into the heavens. The effect was immediate. Up in the highest heaven, the gods, who had been without their sacrificial food and drink for a week, were starving. They smelled the sweet savor of the roasting offering, and in their desperation, they gathered like flies around the smoke, their divine dignity forgotten in their hunger. The first to arrive was the great goddess Ishtar, or as she was known in the oldest stories, Inanna. Her eyes were still filled with grief and rage for her lost humanity. She raised her magnificent necklace of lapis lazuli beads, a gift from her father Anu, and made a solemn vow before the entire assembly. "Gods," she cried, "as surely as I shall not forget this lapis on my neck, I will remember these days and not forget them for all time." She then turned her anger upon the architect of the flood, Enlil, who was just then approaching. "Let all the gods come to the offering," she declared, "but Enlil shall not come, for he, without reason, brought about the flood and consigned my people to destruction." When Enlil saw the boat and the survivors, His rage returned, and he rounded on the other gods. How did a living soul escape? He thundered. No man was to survive the destruction. It was then that Enki was forced to step forward and confess his cleverness, admitting that he had saved Atrahasis by circumventing their oath. He rebuked Enlil for his recklessness. You are the sage of the gods, a hero, Enki said. How could you, without reason, bring about the flood? On the sinner, impose his sin. On the transgressor, impose his transgression. But be merciful, that he not be cut off. A new pact was formed. The gods agreed never again to destroy all of humanity. Instead, to keep their noise in check, they would introduce other means of population control. Some women would be made barren, demons would snatch away infants, and certain classes of priestesses would be sworn to lifelong celibacy. And as for Atrahasis and his wife, Enlil, his anger finally abated. Blessed them, he made them like the gods, granting them eternal life, and sent them to live far away, at the mouth of the rivers, the mythical place where the world's fresh water met the sea. With the world repopulated and the cosmic order restored, let us turn our attention back to the goddess who made that vow, the one whose grief was the sharpest, Inanna. There is no other deity in the pantheon quite like her. She was not a quiet hearth goddess or a distant sky mother. She was a being of dazzling, dangerous contradictions. As the goddess of the morning and evening star, Venus, she was at once the goddess of the tenderest love and the most brutal warfare. She was the patron of beauty, sexual desire, and procreation, her temples served by sacred prostitutes who celebrated the life-giving force of fertility. Yet she was also a goddess of battle, delighting in the clash of weapons and the fall of kings, often depicted with a lion at her feet and armed for combat. She was, above all, the goddess of ambition. Her central story is one of constant, restless acquisition. She was never satisfied with the domains she was given. She always wanted more. Her primary seat of power was in the great city of Uruk, where her temple, the Eanna, or House of Heaven, dominated the landscape. While other gods were content to rule their home cities, Inanna's influence was felt across all of Mesopotamia. Her character, full of such vibrant and often violent contradictions, may reflect a complex view of power and femininity in the ancient world. She was not passive. She was an active, often aggressive force in the cosmos who achieved her goals through a combination of seduction, cunning, and outright force. In one of the most famous myths, she travels to the watery domain of the wise god Enki, shares a feast with him, and after he becomes drunk on beer, she tricks him into giving her the sacred me, over 100 decrees and arts that formed the very basis of civilization, from kingships and law to writing and craft. She loads them onto her boat of heaven and escapes back to Uruk, weathering the magical beasts Enki sends after her in his sober regret. By the single act of divine theft, she vastly enriches her city and herself, becoming the custodian of civilization itself. But even that was not enough. Ruling heaven and earth, love and war, was not enough. There was one great kingdom she did not control, one realm whose power she craved to add to her own. The great below, the land of no return, the bleak, dusty underworld ruled by her elder sister, Ereshkigal. Inanna, queen of heaven and earth, the goddess of the radiant morning star, stood in her temple in Uruk and surveyed her domains. She was the mistress of the Eanna Temple, the custodian of civilization, the terror of battlefields, and the inspiration of lovers. But it was not enough. Her gaze turned downward, her mind set upon the one realm she did not control. From the great above, the ancient poem begins. She set her mind toward the great below. She would journey to the land of no return, the bleak, dusty kingdom ruled by her elder sister, the fearsome Ereshkigal. Her purpose was ambition, pure and simple. She sought to conquer the underworld and add it to her ever-growing list of dominions. This was a journey from which no one, god or mortal, had ever returned, and Inanna knew the danger. She did not go unprepared. She meticulously dressed herself for a spiritual and physical battle, adorning her body with the 7 sacred me that embodied her divine power. On her head, she placed the shagura, the crown of the steppe. Around her neck, she fastened double strands of lapis lazuli beads. Across her breast, she strapped the Come Man Come breastplate. She slipped a gold ring on her wrist, and in her hand she grasped the lapis measuring rod and line, symbols of her authority. Finally, she draped herself in the pala dress, the garment of ladyship. She was no longer just a goddess. She was a walking panoply of divine power, radiant and armed for a hostile takeover. Before setting out, she took one crucial precaution. She summoned her faithful vizier, Ninshubur, the ever-loyal servant who was her messenger and confidant. Ninshubur, she commanded, I am descending to the Kur. If I have not returned in 3 days' time, you must begin a lament for me. Go before the great gods and plead my case. Her instructions were specific. First, go to the temple of Enlil in Nippur. If he will not help me, go to the moon god Nana in Ur. If he too refuses, then you must go to Eridu, to the temple of Enki. I know he will not let me perish. He is the father of wisdom, who knows the food of life, who knows the water of life. He will find a way to restore me. With this fail-safe plan in place, the Queen of Heaven abandoned her temples and her cities and began her descent. She arrived at the outer gates of the underworld, a formidable fortress made of lapis lazuli, and announced her presence with an imperious shout. The chief gatekeeper, Neti, emerged and demanded to know her business. Inanna, cloaking her ambition in false piety, declared, I have come to witness the funeral rites of Gugalana, the bull of heaven, the husband of my elder sister. It was a plausible lie, but Neti was not easily fooled. He instructed the goddess to wait as he went to consult his queen. He found Ereshkigal, the queen of the great below, in her throne room, and her reaction to the news was not one of sisterly welcome. It was pure rage. She saw her beautiful, powerful, and ever-ambitious younger sister at her gates and knew this was no social call. It was an invasion. She has come for my throne, Ereshkigal seethed. She then gave Neti his instructions, a plan of cruel and perfect humiliation. The symbolism of this journey into the dark has been debated for centuries. Is it a story about the cycle of seasons, with the goddess of fertility needing to die in winter and be reborn in spring? Is it a psychological drama about confronting one's own shadow self, the dark sister who rules the hidden parts of the soul? Or is it a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition, of flying too close to the sun, or in this case, descending too close to the abyss? The stripping of Inanna's powers at each gate speaks to a universal truth. In the face of death, all worldly status, power, and identity are rendered meaningless. Neti returned to the gate and addressed Inanna. "You may enter, great queen," he said, "but you must do so according to the laws of the underworld." Inanna, confident in her power, agreed. Nero opened the first gate. As Inanna passed through, he reached out and removed the great crown from her head. "Why have you done this?" she demanded. "Be quiet, Inanna," the gatekeeper replied. "The ways of the underworld are perfect. They may not be questioned." He led her to the second gate, and there he removed her strands of lapis lazuli beads. At the third, he took her breastplate. At the fourth, her gold ring. At the fifth, her measuring rod and line. At the sixth, the beads from her breast. At the seventh and final gate, he stripped her of her pala dress, the garment of ladyship. The Queen of Heaven, now naked, powerless, and utterly vulnerable, was brought into the throne room and pushed before her sister. Ereshkigal, the Queen of Sorrow and Shadow, sat on her throne and fixed her sister with the eye of death. She spoke a single word, a word of wrath. She uttered a single cry, a cry of guilt. At the force of her words, the vibrant, powerful Queen of Heaven was transformed into a lifeless object. Inanna died, and Ereshkigal had her corpse, a greening, rotting side of meat, hung from a hook on her throne room wall. 3 days and 3 nights passed. In the great above, the world began to feel her absence. But in the great below, the Queen of Heaven was nothing but a decaying piece of flesh, a testament to the one law that even the greatest gods cannot defy. On the morning of the 4th day, as the first light touched the ziggurats of Sumer, Inanna's faithful vizier, Ninshubur, began to perform the rites of mourning. Her mistress had not returned. Just as she had been commanded, Ninshubur filled the heavens with her cries of grief. She circled the temples of the great gods, beating a drum, her face etched with sorrow, her body clad in the rough sackcloth of a mourner. Her public display of lament was not just an act of sorrow. It was an alarm sounded across the cosmos, a declaration that the divine order had been broken. The Queen of Heaven was lost. Following her lady's instructions to the letter, Ninshubur went first to the great city of Nippur, to the Akur, the holy temple of Enlil. She threw herself at the feet of the king of the gods and pleaded for his help. "Father Enlil," she wept, "do not let your daughter be put to death in the underworld. Do not let your precious silver be covered with the dust of the Kur. Do not let your precious lapis lazuli be broken into stone for the stoneworker." But Enlil, the stern and unbending enforcer of cosmic law, was unmoved. "My daughter craved the great above, and she craved the great below," he answered coldly. Inanna knew the rules of the underworld, the rites from which no traveler returns. She went to a place of perfect laws. She must abide by them. He would not intervene. Her heart heavy with failure, Ninshubur journeyed to Ur, the city of the moon god Nana, who was Inanna's own father. She repeated her desperate plea, begging him not to let his child perish in the darkness. But Nana, like Enlil, refused to act. He echoed the same grim sentiment. His daughter had gone to the land of no return, and its laws were absolute. He would not and could not help her. 2 of the 3 great gods had refused. All hope now rested on the final name on Inanna's list. Ninshubur traveled to the city of Eridu, the home of Enki, the god of wisdom. She found him in his watery domain of the Apsu and told him of Inanna's fate, how the Queen of Heaven was now a corpse hanging on a hook in the underworld. Unlike the others, Enki was deeply grieved and troubled. The loss of Inanna, with all her vibrant energy and the sacred me she possessed, was a true disaster for the world. But he knew, better than anyone, that a direct assault on the underworld was impossible. Its laws were ancient and unassailable. So he did what he always did. He devised a solution of pure, subtle cunning. The god of craft reached down and scraped the dirt from beneath his fingernails. From this humble, almost profane substance, he fashioned two beings. They were neither male nor female, beings who could exist outside the normal rules of creation. One he named the Kurgara, and the other the Galatur. He gave them the food of life and the water of life, and sent them on a rescue mission with a set of very strange instructions. The concept of the Mesopotamian underworld, the Kur, is essential to understanding this myth. It was not a place of fire and brimstone, of punishment for sins. It was simply the destination for all who died, a bleak and monochrome city of dust. There, the shades of the dead flitted about like bats, eating clay and drinking filthy water, forever trapped in a joyless, shadowy existence. Ereshkigal's rule was absolute, her laws immutable. This is why Enlil and Nanna, for all their power in the world above, were helpless. The Kur was a separate and sovereign reality. Only a trick, a clever exploitation of a loophole, could possibly succeed where divine might would fail. The Kurgara and the Galatur slipped down to the underworld, moving like flies through the cracks in the universe, and passed the 7 gates unnoticed. They arrived in the throne room to find Queen Ereshkigal in a state of profound agony. The texts describe her as being in the throes of a desperate labor, moaning and writhing in pain for the dead and the dying. The 2 creatures from Enki's fingernails did not speak or make demands. They simply began to empathize. When Ereshkigal moaned, "Oh, my inside," they moaned with her, "Oh, your inside." When she cried out, "Oh, my outside," they echoed her, "Oh, your outside." They offered her nothing but the sincere reflection of her own suffering. Ereshkigal, who had never experienced empathy in her lonely kingdom of shadows, was soothed and deeply moved. She stopped her moaning and looked at these strange, sympathetic beings. "Who are you?" she asked, "who groans and sighs with me? I will give you a gift. Ask for what you will." The 2 creatures refused the gifts she offered, the rivers of water or the fields of grain. "We will have," they said, "only the corpse that hangs on the hook." Ereshkigal, bound by her oath, was forced to agree. They took down the rotting piece of meat that had been the Queen of Heaven. One sprinkled it with the food of life, and the other with the water of life. And Inanna arose, restored and whole. She was alive. But just as she prepared to ascend, the Anunnaki, the 7 grim judges of the underworld, seized her. No one, they decreed, ascends from the underworld unmarked. If Inanna wishes to leave the land of no return, she must provide someone to take her place. The law was absolute. A substitute had to be found. Inanna was allowed to leave, but she did not go alone. A host of the Gala, the pitiless demons and sheriffs of the underworld, clung to her, a ghastly entourage whose only purpose was to follow her back to the world of the living and drag her replacement down into the dust. Inanna's ascent from the great below was not a triumphant return to the light, but a grim procession. With every step she took toward the world of the living, she was shadowed by a host of demons, the pitiless bailiffs of the underworld. These were the Gala, and the ancient texts describe them in terrifying detail. They were beings who knew no mercy, who clung to the side of a man. They carried maces in their hands and wore great axes on their belts. They ate no food, they drank no water, they accepted no sweet offerings from mortals, and they took no pleasure in the joys of the family. Their one and only purpose was to snatch souls and drag them down to the waiting arms of Ereshkigal. They were Inanna's demonic escort, her jailers, and they would not leave her side until a substitute had been found. The first person they encountered as they emerged from the darkness was Nanshuber. Inanna's loyal vizier was still waiting, just as her mistress had left her, groveling in the dust, her clothes the rough sackcloth of a true mourner. The Gala immediately fixed their terrible gaze upon her. "Walk on, Inanna," they snarled. "We will take this one. We will take your vizier in your place." But Inanna whirled on them, her eyes blazing with protective fire. "No," she commanded. "This is my faithful servant of the bright word, my warrior who fights by my side." She followed my instructions. She raised a lament for me in the assembly halls. She went to Enlil, to Nanna, and to Enki. It was because of her that I am alive. I will not give her to you. The demons, bound to obey the one they escorted, reluctantly backed away. Ninshuber was saved. The procession continued. Inanna, flanked by her demons, journeyed to the city of Umma. There they found Shara, her son and the city's patron god. He too was in deep mourning, sitting in filth and sackcloth, his heart broken by his mother's apparent death. The Gala moved to take him, but again Inanna intervened, shielding him from their grasp. "He is my son, who mourned for me," she declared. "I will not give him to you." Next, they traveled to the city of Bad Tibera, and there they found the god Lulal. He too was prostrate in the dust, overcome with grief. For a third time, the demons attempted to claim a substitute, and for a third time, Inanna refused, protecting the one who had shown her such loyalty. A pattern was emerging. Those who had properly mourned her, those who had honored her absence with their grief, were granted her protection. Finally, Inanna arrived back at her own great city of Uruk, at the gates of her own temple. She strode toward the great throne, expecting to find it empty and draped in black. But it was not. There, sitting proudly upon her throne, was her husband, the shepherd king Dumuzid. He was not dressed in sackcloth. He was not groveling in the dust. He was wearing his finest, most splendid robes, his face serene, enjoying the power and prestige of ruling in her stead. All the love Inanna had for him, all the passion that had made her choose a mortal shepherd as her consort, curdled in that instant into a substance of pure, cold rage. She had faced death, and he had used her absence to elevate himself. He had not mourned, so he had celebrated. She looked at the horrified demons who could feel the shift in her divine will. Then she looked at her husband, and she fixed him with the eye of death. "That one," she said, her voice a low and terrible command. "Take that one." The figure of Dumuzid, or Tammuz, as the Akkadians called him, is one of the most significant in Mesopotamian religion. He was a god of shepherds and of the vibrant, growing life of the spring and early summer. He represented the sap in the grain, the milk in the ewe, the life-giving power of the date palm. This story of his betrayal and condemnation forms the mythological basis for one of the most important annual rituals in the ancient world. For thousands of years, at the height of the Mesopotamian summer, when the heat killed the vegetation and dried the fields, the people, especially the women, would engage in a period of intense public mourning for the death of Dumuzid. They would weep for the loss of the god of fertility, a ritual that acknowledged the cyclical death of the land itself. This practice was so widespread and ancient that it is even mentioned in the Bible, where the prophet Ezekiel notes with disapproval the women of Jerusalem weeping for Tammuz. Seeing his wife's deadly gaze and the joy on the faces of the Gala, Dumuzid was seized with terror. He fell to his knees, his royal robes trailing in the dust he should have been sitting in all along. He raised his hands and cried out to his brother-in-law, the sun god Utu, the god of justice. Utu, you are my brother, he pleaded. I married your sister. Save me from these demons. Change my hands into the hands of a serpent. Change my feet into the feet of a serpent, that I may escape them and flee to the hills. But it was too late. His fate had been sealed by the one person whose judgment was absolute. The Gala, with whoops of delight, descended upon the shepherd king. They grabbed him, striking him with their axes and maces. They showed him no mercy, this beautiful, proud god who had forgotten to mourn his wife. And as his cries echoed through the palace, they began to drag him away, down toward the bleak and dusty kingdom that had only moments before been Inanna's prison. The cries of the shepherd king Dumuzid echoed through the city of Uruk as the pitiless Gala dragged him toward his doom. But his story did not end there, in that moment of terror and betrayal. His disappearance was marked by the profound and genuine grief of his sister, Geshtinana. A goddess of the grapevine and of autumn, she was everything her brother, in his final moments, was not. Loyal, selfless, and utterly heartbroken, she wandered the arid plains of Sumer, weeping and searching for her lost brother, her lament a stark contrast to the proud silence Dumuzid had kept during his wife's ordeal. This pure, sisterly devotion seems to have touched even the hardened heart of Inanna, who, perhaps feeling a pang of regret for her own swift and terrible judgment, eventually led the grieving sister to her brother's hiding place. In the face of Geshtinana's unwavering love, a new decree was made, a compromise that would forever tie the fate of the earth to the family drama of the gods. Dumuzid would not be forced to remain in the underworld for all eternity. Instead, he and his sister would share the burden. For one half of the year, Dumuzid would be king of the underworld, his absence from the world above marking the dry, scorching summer when the grasses withered and the flocks grew thin. For the other half of the year, the devoted Geshtinana would take his place in the darkness, allowing her brother to return to the great above. His return would usher in the spring, the time of new lambs, flowing milk, and the greening of the earth. And so, the great cycle was established. The seasons were no longer just a feature of the cosmos. They were an annual story of death, sacrifice, loyalty, and rebirth, a rhythm of sorrow and joy that pulsed through the heart of Mesopotamian life. With this cosmic cycle providing the backdrop for life and death, let us turn our gaze to the city at the very center of this divine drama, Uruk. This was no mythical landscape, no city in the clouds. Uruk was a real place, one of the first true cities in the history of the world. A sprawling metropolis of sun-baked brick on the banks of the Euphrates, its skyline was dominated by the great temple of Inanna. It was a city of scribes, of merchants, of craftsmen, and of kings. And at this time, it was ruled by a king who was more than a man, a king whose name would echo through history long after his city had turned to dust. Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was a figure of immense and terrifying power, a legend in his own lifetime. He was, the story tells us, 2/3 god and 1/3 man. His mother was the wise goddess Ninsun, and his father was the deified former king, Lugalbanda. This divine blood gave him a body of breathtaking perfection, strength that no mortal could match, and a restless driving energy that burned like a fire. But his 1/3 mortality, his human part, filled him with a wild and unchecked arrogance. He was a king without an equal, and therefore without restraint. He was a tyrant. The epic begins not with a celebration of his glory, but with a list of his abuses. The walls of Uruk, which would one day be his most famous legacy, were built on the backs of his people through forced and relentless labor. He drove the young men to the point of exhaustion, day and night, allowing them no rest. He was a wild bull rampaging through his own city, his appetites absolute. The poem states that he leaves no son to his father, and most grievously, he leaves no virgin to her lover. This is the lament of a people suffering under the ancient and terrible practice of the Lord's right, the king claiming for himself every bride on her wedding night. He was the shepherd of his people, but he had become the wolf. This portrayal of Gilgamesh is a fascinating look into the Mesopotamian ideal of kingship. The historical Gilgamesh was a real king of Uruk in the 27th century BCE, a powerful ruler credited with building the city's defensive walls. The myth that grew around him is not just an adventure story. It's a profound exploration of what it means to be a good king, and indeed, what it means to be human. The epic starts with a king who is more god than man, his power untempered by humility or any sense of his own limitations. His journey will be one that strips him of his arrogance and forces him to confront the very mortality he has, until now, ignored. But for now, he was simply a tyrant, and the people of Uruk could bear it no longer. Unable to challenge their godlike king directly, they did the only thing they could. They cried out to the heavens. Their lamentations, their pleas for relief from their own sovereign, rose up from the streets of Uruk and reached the ears of the great gods. Anu, the distant father of the heavens, heard their cries and summoned the divine assembly. This wild bull Gilgamesh, the gods declared, he has no equal. His arrogance is absolute. They knew that to challenge him with force would be to destroy the very city they sought to save. They needed a different solution. They needed to create a counterweight, a rival, a second self who could meet his energy, absorb his passions, and turn his wildness away from his own people. Their gaze fell upon Aruru, the goddess of creation, the one who had helped fashion humanity from clay and blood. You, Aruru, created this man, they commanded. Now create his second self. Let him be his equal in spirit, a match for his stormy heart. Let them contend with each other, that Uruk may have peace. Hearing the unified cry of the people of Uruk, the goddess of creation, Aruru, set to her task. She went to a quiet place, ritually washed her hands, and then pinched off a piece of primordial clay, the very same substance from which the first humans had been fashioned. She thought of the wild energy of Gilgamesh, of his stormy heart and his godlike form. With this image in her mind, she threw the piece of clay not into the city, but far out into the wilderness, into the vast, empty steppe, and from that lonely clump of earth she sculpted a new being. This was Enkidu. He was not born of woman. He was a child of the silence and the wild places. His creation was a direct answer to the sophisticated, walled-in tyranny of Gilgamesh. Where Gilgamesh was a product of the city, Enkidu was a being of pure nature. His entire body was covered in matted hair, and the hair on his head was long and wild like a woman's, flowing down like the waving stalks of barley. He knew nothing of cultivated land or of human society. He was, in every sense, a wild man. His companions were not people, but the herds of the steppe. He ate grass alongside the gazelles, and he jostled for space at the waterhole with the wild beasts, his thirst slaked by the same muddy water that they drank. He was not just among them, he was one of them. He became their protector, a shepherd to the wild flock. His existence was soon discovered by a trapper, a man who made his living from the very animals Enkidu now protected. For 3 days, the trapper went out to his hunting grounds and found his work undone. The pits he had dug to catch animals were filled in. The snares he had carefully set were sprung and empty. The game had scattered. Then, at the waterhole, he saw the cause. A man, wild and immensely powerful, moving among the animals as their guardian. The trapper tried to approach, but he was paralyzed by a primal fear. The sheer aura of strength and untamed wildness emanating from Enkidu was more terrifying than that of any lion. He fled back to his father's hut, his face pale, his heart pounding, unable to act. He told his father of the wild man who roamed the steppe, who let the beasts escape, and who made his livelihood impossible. The father, old and wise in the ways of the world, gave his son advice that would change the course of history. "Do not try to fight him, my son," he said. "His strength is not of this world. Instead of meeting wildness with force, you must meet it with something more powerful, civilization. Go to Uruk, find the great king Gilgamesh, tell him of this man, and ask him to grant you a woman, one of the temple courtesans. And bring her here, and let her reveal her charms to him. When the wild beasts see him with her, they will reject him. His own herd will abandon him, and his connection to the wild will be broken." This was a plan of profound psychological and theological depth. In the Mesopotamian worldview, Shamhat, the woman the trapper would be given, was not a mere seductress. As a courtesan of the temple of Inanna, she was a vessel of civilization itself. Her arts, of sexuality, of tenderness, of human connection, were seen as the primary force that drew a man out of a state of nature and into the structured world of society. Sexuality was not a sin. It was the sacred and powerful tool that initiated the wild into the ways of culture. Shamhat's role was not to corrupt Enkidu, but to complete him, to teach him a part of existence he never knew, and in doing so, to make him human. The trapper did as his father advised. He journeyed to the great city of Uruk, and he was brought before King Gilgamesh. He told the king of the wild man, a being whose strength was like a rock from the sky, who protected the animals and thwarted all his attempts at hunting. Gilgamesh, whose arrogance was matched only by his curiosity, was intrigued. The thought of another being in the world who could rival his own strength was an irresistible challenge. He saw the wisdom in the old trapper's plan. He would not send soldiers, he would send Shamhat. "Go, trapper," Gilgamesh commanded, "and take with you the courtesan Shamhat. When the wild man comes to the waterhole with his herd, let her disrobe and reveal her beauty. He will see her and go to her, and his beasts, who grew up with him, will deny him." And so the trapper and the woman set out from the walled city of Uruk and journeyed back into the endless, silent steppe. They did not search for Enkidu. They simply went to the waterhole, the place where all the threads of life in the wilderness converged. There they sat and waited for one day, then two. On the third day, as the wild herds came down to the water to drink, Enkidu was with them. He knelt beside the gazelles, his wild hair brushing the surface of the water as he drank. And there, from across the waterhole, he saw something he had never seen before, a being unlike any of the animals he knew. It was Shamhat, waiting, ready to fulfill the command of her king and the will of the gods. As Enkidu knelt by the waterhole, he saw Shamhat, and in that moment, the world of instinct and the world of culture collided. The trapper, as he was instructed, faded back, leaving the courtesan to her task. Shamhat did not hide or flee. She let her garments fall, revealing herself to the wild man. Enkidu, who had known only the company of beasts, was captivated. He came to her, and for 6 days and 7 nights, she initiated him into the arts of humanity, into the mysteries of love and tenderness that were her sacred duty. In that week, a profound transformation took place. The wildness in him was not broken, but was instead overlaid with a new and powerful layer of human consciousness. When the 7 nights were over, Enkidu, his mind and body changed, went to seek out his herd. He saw the gazelles grazing in the distance and moved to rejoin them, but as he approached, they caught his scent and bolted. The animals of the steppe, his only family, now saw him as other, as a man. He tried to run with them as he once had, to chase the wild donkeys across the plains, but his legs felt heavy, his knees failed him. His primal speed was gone. He had lost his connection to the wild, but he had gained something in its place. The ancient text says he had wisdom now, a broader understanding. He returned, slower and more thoughtful, to where Shamhat sat waiting. She began to teach him of the world he was now a part of. She told him of Uruk, the great city with its mighty walls, and of its king, the magnificent and terrible Gilgamesh. "He is a man of awesome strength," she said, "like a wild bull. No one can stand against him." As she spoke, she divided her own garment in two, giving half to Enkidu so he could cover his nakedness. She then led him from the wilderness to the edge of civilization, to a camp of shepherds. For Enkidu, it was another new world. The shepherds gathered around, marveling at this giant of a man, how he looked like a star fallen from the heavens. They placed before him the food of civilization, bread and beer. Enkidu stared at it, confused. He had only ever eaten grass and drunk water from the river. Shamhat had to show him what to do. "Eat the bread, Enkidu," she coached him gently. "It is the staff of life. Drink the beer. It is the custom of the land." He ate the bread until he was full. He drank 7 goblets of the beer, and his heart expanded. His face glowed, and he broke into song. For the first time, he felt joy. He then allowed the shepherds to wash him, to anoint his hairy body with oil, and to give him proper clothes. He was no longer a wild man. He was a human. This transition from nature to culture is one of the epic's central themes, and it is not presented as a simple victory. Enkidu loses his primal innocence, his effortless grace within the natural world. This is a genuine loss, yet he gains self-awareness, companionship, and a place within human society. The shepherd's camp serves as a crucial intermediary step, a place halfway between the pure wilderness and the high urban culture of Uruk. It is here that Enkidu finds a new purpose. Taking up a weapon for the first time, he becomes the shepherd's guardian, using his great strength to hunt the wolves and lions that preyed on their flocks. The former protector of the wild beasts was now the protector of domesticated man. One day, a man arrived at the camp, weary from his journey from Uruk. He was a messenger, come to invite the shepherds to a wedding feast in the city. But his news was soured by a bitter complaint. At the wedding, he explained, the drum is beaten, the bride is made beautiful for her husband, but Gilgamesh, the king, will lie with her first. It is his right decreed by the gods. Hearing of this injustice, of this abuse of power, a righteous fury was kindled in Enkidu's newly civilized heart. All that Shamhat had told him about the arrogant king now made sense. He finally had a purpose, a reason to go to the great city. "I will go to Uruk," he declared, his voice booming. "I will challenge him. I will shout in the streets. I am the strongest. I will be the one to change the order of things." He traveled with Shamhat to the great city. When he arrived, the people of Uruk thronged around him, astonished by his massive frame and raw power. They saw in him a perfect match for their own unbearable king. That evening, as the wedding feast began, Enkidu went and stood in the doorway of the bride's house, his huge body blocking the entrance. When Gilgamesh arrived to claim his tyrannical right, he found his path barred by a stranger, his equal in size and ferocity. Without a word, the two titans lunged at each other. They grappled in the street, their bodies crashing against the walls of the houses, making the doorposts tremble. The wrestling match was a storm of fury and strength, a perfect equilibrium of power. But in the end, Gilgamesh, with his 2/3 divinity, proved the stronger. With a final mighty effort, he forced Enkidu to his knee. Gilgamesh had won, but as his anger from the fight subsided, he looked at the man he had defeated, and he saw not an enemy but himself. The god's plan had worked. The fight had drained the poison of his arrogance, and in its place was a profound respect. The two heroes embraced, their enmity instantly transformed into a deep and abiding friendship. The king of Uruk had finally found his equal. The bond forged between Gilgamesh and Enkidu in their titanic struggle brought a welcome peace to Uruk. The king's wild, destructive energy, which had so long been turned inward against his own people, now had an outlet in a friendship with his perfect equal. But for a man like Gilgamesh, two-thirds god and all restless energy, peace soon felt like idleness. Lounging in his palace, a profound listlessness began to creep into his heart, and with it, the first cold whisper of a terrifying thought, the thought of his own mortality. He was the strongest man in the world, the greatest of kings, but even he would one day have to die. This realization spurred him not to despair, but to action. He went to his new friend and brother Enkidu with a grand and dangerous proposal. "My friend," he began, his voice burning with a new purpose, "I have grown idle. My heart is heavy. I must do something that the world has never seen. I will go on a great journey, and I will set up my name in a place where famous names are written. I propose we travel to the great cedar forest, cut down its tallest trees, and bring them back to Uruk." But this was more than a logging expedition. "We must," he said, his eyes gleaming, "kill its guardian, the ferocious monster Humbaba, and destroy this evil from the land." Enkidu, who had grown up in the wilderness and knew its ancient secrets and terrors, was horrified. His face went pale. "How can we go to the cedar forest?" he stammered. "I know this Humbaba. The great god Enlil himself appointed him to guard the sacred cedars. His roar is the floodstorm, his breath is fire, and his jaws are death itself. He can hear a deer stir in the forest from 60 leagues away. Who would willingly go to his domain? He is a creature you cannot defeat." He pleaded with his friend to abandon the reckless idea, but Gilgamesh's resolve was absolute. He clapped his hand on his friend's shoulder, his expression a mixture of courage and a deep, fatalistic sorrow. "My dear friend," he said, "only the gods live forever with the sun god Shamash. As for mankind, our days are numbered. Whatever we achieve is but a puff of wind. Why are you afraid of death? If I fall, I will have made a name for myself. They will say, 'Gilgamesh fell in glorious battle against Humbaba the Terrible.' A man's life is short. It is better to die in a blaze of glory than to fade away in quiet obscurity." Shamed by his own fear and inspired by his friend's unwavering courage, Enkidu reluctantly agreed to go. Their quest was not undertaken lightly or in secret. They first went before the council of elders in Uruk. The old men, wise and cautious, echoed Enkidu's warnings. "You are young, Gilgamesh," they advised, "and your heart has carried you away. Humbaba is not a foe to be taken lightly." But seeing that the king's mind was made up, they gave him their reluctant blessing, urging him to be cautious and to let Enkidu, who knew the paths of the wilderness, walk before him. The significance of cedar in Mesopotamia cannot be overstated. In the flat, river-fed plains of Sumer and Akkad, quality timber was almost non-existent. Cedar, imported at great expense from the distant mountains of Lebanon, was a precious, almost divine resource. It was strong, aromatic, and rot-resistant, the only material worthy of building the great doors of a temple or the cult statue of a god. A journey to the cedar forest was therefore the ultimate civilizing mission, to venture into the wild, chaotic periphery of the world, defeat the monstrous forces of nature that guarded its resources, and bring that wealth back to the ordered heart of civilization, the city of Uruk. Before they departed, Gilgamesh led Enkidu to the temple to see his mother, the goddess Ninsun. She, too, was filled with a mother's dread, but she knew she could not stop her son. Instead, she performed a powerful ritual. She climbed to the roof of the temple, bathed, and put on her finest robes. She lit incense as an offering to the great sun god, Shamash, the god of travelers and of justice. She prayed to him, asking why he had given her son such a restless, unappeasable heart, and she begged the god to watch over him on his journey, to guide him by day and protect him by night. Then, in a gesture of profound significance, she turned to Enkidu. She placed a sacred token around his neck and formally adopted him as her own. "Though you are not of my womb," she declared, "I now entrust my son Gilgamesh to you. Bring him back to me safely." Their bond of friendship was now sealed as a sacred brotherhood. Finally, they went to the forges of Uruk and commanded the smiths to make them weapons worthy of such a quest. The smiths cast gigantic axes, each weighing 180 pounds, and forged enormous swords, their hilts and blades weighing 60 pounds apiece. Armed and armored like gods, blessed by the elders, and adopted into the royal family, the two heroes were ready. They strode to the great gates of Uruk, and the entire populace, from the elders to the children, walked with them, their faces streaked with tears, wishing them well as the two brothers set out on the long and perilous road to the cedar forest. The journey to the cedar forest was an epic in itself. The two heroes, moving with the strength of gods, covered in 6 days a distance that would take ordinary men a month and a half. They crossed 7 mountains, their gigantic weapons slung over their shoulders. At the end of each day's travel, as twilight settled over the strange new lands, they would perform a ritual. Enkidu would prepare their camp for the night, while Gilgamesh would climb to the highest point of a nearby mountain, dig a small well, and make an offering of fine flour, praying to the sun god Shamash for guidance in the form of a dream. And the dreams came, each one more terrifying than the last. They were dark, violent visions that shook the king of Uruk to his core. In one, a great mountain loomed over them, and then it collapsed, its landslide trapping Gilgamesh's legs. But just as he was about to be crushed, a glorious, shining man appeared, pulled him free from the rubble, and gave him water to drink. Gilgamesh awoke in a cold sweat, but Enkidu, ever the loyal friend, interpreted the vision optimistically. "The mountain, my friend, is not a mountain," he explained. "It is the monster Humbaba. Though he may fall upon us, we will defeat him." In another dream, Gilgamesh wrestled with a celestial wild bull, its breath scorching the earth, its bellowing splitting the sky. Again, Enkidu soothed his friend's fears, claiming the bull was not an enemy, but the glorious Shamash, their divine protector, who would aid them in their fight. A third dream was the most ominous. The skies went black, lightning split the heavens, and a fire rained down, turning everything to ash. Gilgamesh was terrified, but Enkidu, determined to keep their courage alive, insisted that the dream foretold their own fiery victory over the monster. Finally, after their long and psychologically grueling journey, they arrived. They stood at the edge of the great cedar forest, and for a moment they were silenced by its majesty. The trees towered over them, their canopy so dense it created a permanent twilight on the forest floor, their scent filling the air with a sacred perfume. This was the Cedar Mountain, the dwelling place of the gods, a place of profound and intimidating beauty. As they stepped across the threshold of the forest, all their bravado fell away, replaced by a deep and chilling fear. From the heart of the forest, the guardian emerged. Humbaba was more terrible than any of the stories had described. His face was a grotesque mask of coiled intestines. His teeth were the fangs of a dragon, and his gaze was death. He let out a roar that was the sound of the flood storm, and the very ground trembled. He fixed his terrifying eyes on the two heroes and mocked them. "You," he growled at Gilgamesh, "a little man who knows nothing of the world. Why have you come here to challenge me? I will rip the flesh from your bones and feed it to the vultures." At the sight and sound of the monster, Gilgamesh's courage utterly failed him. A weakness washed over him, and he stood paralyzed by fear. But Enkidu rushed to his side. "My friend, remember your boasts in Uruk," he shouted. "Remember your promise to your mother. We must stand together. A rope of 2 strands is not easily broken." Enkidu's words rekindled the fire in Gilgamesh's heart. Together they cried out to the heavens, calling on their patron Shamash, and the sun god heard their plea. Honoring the prayer of the goddess Ninsun, he gathered the great winds of the world and unleashed them all at once against the monster. The great wind, the north wind, the south wind, the whirlwind, the storm wind, the ice wind, 13 winds in total, a maelstrom of divine power that flew at Humbaba from every direction. The winds blinded him with dust, buffeted him so he could not move forward or backward, and pinned him in place. The terrible guardian was rendered helpless. Seeing his advantage, Gilgamesh took up his great axe. Humbaba, trapped in the whirlwind, suddenly changed his tone. He pleaded for his life. "Spare me, Gilgamesh," he cried. "Let me be your servant. This forest will be yours. I will cut the sacred cedars for you and build you a palace." The king of Uruk was moved by the monster's plea and turned to Enkidu, considering mercy. But Enkidu was ruthless. "Do not listen to him, my friend," he warned. "A captured wolf cannot be trusted. If we let him go, he will surely turn on us. We must kill him now to secure our victory." Gilgamesh, trusting his brother's grim counsel, stepped forward. As Humbaba cursed them both, Gilgamesh, with one blow of his mighty axe, struck his neck, and Enkidu followed with his sword. They had done the impossible. The great and terrible guardian of the cedar forest was dead. They cut off his monstrous head as a trophy, and the rivers and hills rejoiced at the death of the tyrant of the wilderness. With their quest complete, they began to fell the towering cedars, choosing the finest and tallest to build a great new door for Enlil's temple in the holy city of Nippur. They fashioned a raft, and with their precious cargo of timber and the ghastly head of their vanquished foe, they floated triumphantly back down the Euphrates River toward Uruk. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu arrived back in Uruk, their raft laden with the finest cedar and the ghastly head of Humbaba, they were met with a city delirious with joy. The heroes, who had left under a cloud of fear and doubt, had returned as living legends. Gilgamesh, no longer the idle tyrant, was now the glorious vanquisher of monsters, the protector of his city. He washed the grime of his journey from his long hair, cast off his soiled traveling clothes, and dressed himself in his finest royal robes. He placed the crown of Uruk upon his head, and in that moment he was the very image of a perfect king. his divine beauty and heroic glory shining for all to see. And from her temple, the goddess of Uruk, the magnificent, the powerful, and ever desirous Ishtar, looked upon him. She saw his perfection, she saw his glory, and she was overcome with lust. She appeared before the triumphant king, her divine radiance a match for his own. "Come, Gilgamesh," she purred, her voice the promise of all earthly and divine delights. "Be my husband, give me your fruit, you shall be my man, and I will be your woman." She offered him a bride price of unimaginable splendor, a chariot of lapis lazuli with wheels of pure gold, drawn by storm demons. She promised that kings and princes would bow down before him and that his flocks and herds would multiply with unnatural fertility. She offered him a place by her side as the consort of the most powerful goddess in the land. Any other man would have fallen to his knees in gratitude, but Gilgamesh, his pride now inflated to the size of the heavens by his victory over Humbabop, looked upon the goddess not with reverence, but with contempt. His rejection was not a polite refusal. It was a torrent of scorn, a brutal and public humiliation. "And what would I have to give you in return for being your husband?" he sneered. "You are a faulty door that lets in the wind, a palace that crushes its own heroes, a leaky wineskin that soaks the carrier. Which of your lovers have you loved forever? Which of your shepherds has pleased you for all time?" He then began to list, like a prosecutor, the fates of her former lovers. "You loved the shepherd Tammuz," he taunted, referencing the tragic fate of her husband Muzid, "and you decreed for him an annual weeping. You loved the colorful roller bird, and then you broke its wing. You loved the lion, perfect in strength, and then you dug 7 and 7 pits for him. You loved the stallion, magnificent in battle, and you decreed for him the whip, the spur, and the lash. You loved the chief shepherd, and you turned him into a wolf, so his own dogs now chase him away. You loved your father's gardener, Ishulanu, and when he respectfully refused you, you turned him into a frog. And if you love me," he concluded, his voice dripping with disdain, "you will treat me just as you have treated them." This dual nature of Ishtar was well known. She was the goddess of sweet love and procreation, but she was also the merciless goddess of war, fickle and ferocious. To be her lover was to court both ecstasy and ruin. Gilgamesh's speech, while brutally true, was an act of supreme and foolish arrogance. He had not just spurned a goddess, he had publicly shamed her, cataloging her tragedies and betrayals before the very city that worshipped her. Ishtar's desire instantly turned to a white-hot rage. Humiliated and furious, she ascended to the heavens, her face streaked with tears, and stormed into the court of her father, the great sky god Anu. "Father," she shrieked, "Gilgamesh has insulted me. He has recited a list of my abominable deeds and my betrayals." She then made her demand. "Give me the bull of heaven. I will unleash it on Uruk, and it will gore Gilgamesh to death. I will have my vengeance." Anu was hesitant. Unleashing the celestial bull was no small matter. "If I give you the bull of heaven," he warned her, "it will cause 7 years of drought and famine on the earth. Have you prepared for this? Have you stored up enough grain for the people and fodder for the cattle to survive?" Ishtar, consumed by her need for revenge, was ready. "I have," she lied. "I have stored grain for 7 years, and grass for 7 years. She then issued a terrifying ultimatum, a threat to overturn the entire cosmic order. "If you refuse to give me the bull of heaven," she screamed, "I will go down to the underworld. I will smash its gates and bolt bars. I will raise up the dead, and they will eat the living, and the dead will outnumber the living." Faced with this threat, the complete annihilation of the barrier between life and death, Anu had no choice. He relented. With a heavy heart, he placed the celestial nose rope of the bull of heaven into his daughter's hand, and Ishtar, her heart filled with triumphant hatred, began to lead the monstrous, snorting beast down from the heavens, its hooves striking the sky like thunder, its destination the great walled city of Uruk and the arrogant king who had dared to spurn her love. Led by the vengeful Ishtar, the bull of heaven descended upon the city of Uruk. This was no ordinary beast. It was a creature of celestial power, a living instrument of famine and destruction. When it reached the city, it let out a mighty snort, and its breath was so powerful that a great chasm opened in the earth, and 100 of Uruk's young men fell in and were killed. It snorted a second time, and another crack fissured the ground, swallowing 200 more men. The bull snorted a third time, and a chasm opened directly at the feet of Enkidu. He was thrown off balance, but with a great leap of his powerful legs, he jumped clear, escaping the pit of death. Shaken, but filled with a warrior's fury, Enkidu called out to his friend, "My brother, we have boasted of our glory. How shall we answer this challenge?" He saw the path to victory not in brute force, but in teamwork. "If we work together," he shouted over the bull's bellows, "we can defeat it. I will circle behind it and seize it by its thick tail. You, my friend, must be the blade. Dodge its horns and drive your sword between its neck and its horns into its throat." It was a plan of incredible risk, relying on their perfect trust and coordination. The two heroes sprang into action. Enkidu, using his speed and knowledge of the wild, darted and weaved, avoiding the bull's charges until he could get behind it. He grabbed its tail with all his might, anchoring the celestial beast and digging his heels into the earth. The bull thrashed and roared, trying to shake him off, but Enkidu held fast, a human pivot around which the divine destruction raged. This gave Gilgamesh his chance. Like a matador, he faced the bull's deadly horns, dancing away from its lunges until the perfect moment. Following his friend's direction, he plunged his great sword deep into the monster's neck. The bull of heaven shuddered, let out one final gurgling roar, and crashed to the ground dead. They had done the unthinkable. They had slain Humbaba, the monster of Enlil. Now they had killed the bull of heaven, the property of the great god Anu himself. They ripped out the bull's heart, and in a gesture of piety that mixed with their defiance, they presented it as an offering to their protector, the glorious sun god Shamash. From the great walls of Uruk, Ishtar had watched the entire battle. When she saw her champion, her instrument of vengeance, fall dead in the street, she let out a piercing shriek of fury and grief. She climbed atop the walls, in full view of the populace, and uttered a terrible curse. "Woe to Gilgamesh," she cried, "for he has slandered me and has killed the bull of heaven." Enkidu, hearing her curse from below, was filled with the same arrogant rage that had led Gilgamesh to reject the goddess in the first place. In an act of shocking impiety, He wrenched the bull's right thigh from its carcass and flung it up at the goddess's face as she stood on the wall. "If only I could get my hands on you," he roared, "I would do to you as I have done to him. I would hang his entrails from your arms." This was the final, unforgivable transgression. To kill a divine beast was a crime. To physically assault a great goddess with its remains was an act of rebellion against the entire cosmic order. It was a moment of supreme human hubris, and it would not go unpunished. While Ishtar gathered her sacred temple courtesans to perform a ritual lament for the bull's thigh, Gilgamesh and the people of Uruk celebrated their victory. Gilgamesh summoned the city's craftsmen to marvel at the bull's horns. They were enormous, made of pure lapis lazuli, 30 pounds in weight. He had them coated in gold and hung them as trophies in his royal bedroom. That night, a great victory feast was held in the palace. The heroes were at the absolute peak of their power and fame, having saved their city from a divinely wrought disaster. They were invincible, but the gods are not mocked so easily. While Uruk celebrated, the divine assembly was convening in the heavens. The defiance of the two heroes had shaken the foundations of their authority, and a price would have to be paid. That night, after the celebrations had ended and the heroes lay sleeping in the palace, Enkidu had a dream. It was a dark and terrifying vision, a message from the gods that would bring their glorious adventure to a sudden and tragic end. The bill for their arrogance had come due. The night of victory gave way to a morning of dread. Enkidu woke from a feverish sleep and went to his friend, his face ashen. "My brother," he said, his voice heavy with a new and terrible knowledge, "listen to the dream I had last night." He described a visions of the heavens where the great gods were gathered in a solemn council. Anu, the father, was there, and the warrior Enlil. The wise god Ea was there, and their protector, the sun god Shamash. And Enlil, his heart still filled with anger over the death of Humbaba and the bull of heaven, rose to speak. "Because they have killed the bull of heaven," he decreed, "and have slain Humbaba, one of them must die." Enlil's gaze fell upon Enkidu. It was he who had urged Gilgamesh to kill the pleading Humbaba. It was he who had flung the bull's thigh at the goddess Ishtar. The sun god Shamash, ever their advocate, spoke up in their defense. "Did they not kill the bull of heaven and Humbaba at my command?" he argued, trying to shield them from Enlil's wrath. But this only enraged the king of the gods further. "And is this why you now travel with them every day, as if you were one of their kind?" he snarled at Shamash. The decree was made, the judgment was final, and it was sealed by the highest gods in the universe. Enkidu was the one who must die. Gilgamesh would be spared, but his punishment would be to suffer the loss. As the dream's dark prophecy left his lips, Enkidu's strength began to fail him. A sickness, born not of any earthly cause but of a divine curse, took hold of his body. He grew weak, and the mighty wild man who had wrestled with the king of Uruk was now confined to his sickbed, a prisoner in his own failing body. As he lay there, day after day, his strength seeping away, his grief turned to a bitter, burning rage. He looked at the great cedar door they had brought back as a trophy, the door he had helped fashion, and he cursed it. "If I had known this would be the price," he moaned, "I would have shattered you with my axe." He then cursed the instruments of his own transformation, the path that had led him from the freedom of the wilderness to this tragic, civilized death. He cursed the trapper who had first laid eyes on him, wishing that his traps would forever be empty and his livelihood ruined. And then he saved his most venomous and heartbreaking curse for Shamhat, the temple courtesan who had taught him the ways of humanity. He cursed her to a life of misery and sorrow, to be an outcast, to have her beauty fade, and to be left with nothing but bitterness in her old age. He blamed her for everything. "You took me from my innocent life with the beasts," he cried out in his fever, "and you brought me here to this great friendship, only for it to be stolen from me. You brought me to my death." From the heavens, the sun god Shamash heard his unjust curses and was saddened. He spoke down to the dying man, his voice a quiet rebuke. "Enkidu, why do you curse the woman Shamhat? Was it not she who gave you the food of the gods to eat and the drink of kings to drink? Was it not she who clothed you in fine robes and who gave you the glorious Gilgamesh to be your dearest friend?" The god's words were a gentle reminder of the great joys his new life had brought him, however short. "And now," Shamash continued, "your brother Gilgamesh will mourn you. He will let his hair grow long and matted. He will wander the wild steppe, clad only in the skin of a lion, weeping for his friend." Hearing of the profound grief his death would cause his beloved friend, Enkidu's heart softened and his rage melted away into shame. He looked up to the heavens and retracted his curse upon Shamhat. Instead, he blessed her, wishing that kings and nobles would fall in love with her and shower her with jewels and gold for the kindness she had shown him. He had made his peace with his fate. He lay on his bed for 12 agonizing days. In his final lucid moments, he told Gilgamesh of one last vision, a glimpse into the land of no return. He described the house of dust, where the dead sit in darkness, where kings and priests are now nothing but servants to the grim queen Ereshkigal, their crowns put away, their bodies clothed in feathers like birds. Having shared this terrifying final vision, Enkidu fell silent and his life departed. Gilgamesh was paralyzed by a grief so profound it bordered on madness. He sat beside his friend's body for 6 days and 7 nights, refusing to allow him to be buried, convinced that his cries of sorrow could somehow bring him back. He would touch his chest, hoping to feel a heartbeat, but there was nothing. The stillness was absolute. Only when he saw a maggot fall from his friend's nostril did the terrible, final, and undeniable reality crash down upon him. Enkidu, his brother, his other self, was gone forever. And in that moment, the king of Uruk was struck by a new and even more terrifying thought. If this could happen to Enkidu, a man as strong as himself, then it could and would happen to him. The moment the finality of death pierced through Gilgamesh's denial, a grief unlike any the world had ever known was unleashed. The great king of Uruk let out a roar of pure animal sorrow that echoed from the walls of his palace. He began to pace back and forth like a lioness robbed of her cubs. He tore at his hair, ripped the fine robes from his body, and cast off his royal jewelry as if it were filth. He then turned to the still body of his friend and began a great lament, a eulogy of shattering beauty and pain. He spoke to the natural world that had once been Enkidu's home, calling on it to share his grief. May the paths of the cedar forest, where we walked together, mourn for you now, he cried. May the beasts of the steppe, the gazelle and the wild donkey who were once your family, weep for you. May the Euphrates River, where we drew water for our journey, cry for you. He then addressed the people of his city, the elders and the young men, reminding them of his friend's strength and loyalty. But his most heartbreaking words were for Enkidu himself. My friend, my younger brother, he wept, who chased the wild ass of the hills and the panther of the steppe. We who met and scaled the mountain, who seized and killed the bull of heaven, who overthrew Humbaba in the cedar forest. What sleep is this that has taken hold of you? You are shrouded in darkness, and you cannot hear me. His grief was not limited to words. Gilgamesh, the great king, would give his friend a funeral worthy of a god. He summoned the master craftsmen of Uruk, the goldsmiths, the stonecutters, the jewelers, and commanded them to create a magnificent statue of Enkidu. His body would be of lapis lazuli, his breast of the purest gold. He laid out a great feast and made offerings to the gods of the underworld, presenting treasures of honey and carnelian to Ereshkigal, hoping to buy his friend some small comfort in the house of dust. But after the funeral was over, after the last of the mourners had gone home, Gilgamesh's sorrow did not lessen. It festered. It transformed from grief into a raw and consuming terror. The king who had washed and robed himself in splendor after his victory now refused to wash at all. He cast aside his kingly garments and clothed himself in the rough, uncured skin of a lion. He let his hair grow long and wild, his face becoming gaunt and weathered. In his grief, the great king of civilization had taken on the appearance of the wild man his friend had once been. He began to roam the empty plains outside his city, weeping and crying out the question that now haunted his every waking moment. My friend, whom I loved so dearly, is now turned to clay. Shall I not die too? Am I not just like Enkidu? Must I lie down in the dust and never rise again for all eternity? This terror of oblivion became his new obsession. Fame, glory, power, they were all meaningless in the face of the silent, dusty reality of the grave. But then, a sliver of a desperate hope entered his mind. There was a legend, a story of one man who had escaped the fate of all mortals, a man named Utnapishtim. He was the survivor of the Great Flood, the one whom the gods, in a unique and unrepeated act, had granted the gift of eternal life. He lived in a mythical land called Dilmun, at the very edge of the world, at the place where the rivers meet the sea. Gilgamesh seized upon this story. He would find this Utnapishtim the faraway. He would force from him the secret of his immortality. It was a mad, impossible quest, a journey no living person had ever made. It meant abandoning his throne, his city, his duties as king. He cared for none of it. His quest was no longer for a great name, but for a great escape from the finality of death. The Mesopotamian view of the afterlife made his terror all the more potent. There was no paradise awaiting great heroes, no reward for a life well lived. For everyone, from the highest king to the lowliest servant, the destination was the same, the bleak, gray, and eternal boredom of the Kur, the land of no return. It was a kingdom of shadows, a place devoid of joy or light. Gilgamesh's quest was, therefore, a profound rebellion against the most fundamental and dreaded aspect of his culture's cosmology. he refused to accept his fate. And so, clad in his lion skin, his face streaked with tears and dirt, the once glorious king of Uruk turned his back on his city and began to walk alone into the vast and dangerous wilderness, his one and only goal to find the man who had cheated death. Gilgamesh, now a king only in memory, journeyed into the vast wilderness. His grief was a physical weight upon him, but his purpose was a fire that drove him forward. One night, as he prepared to sleep in a mountain pass, he was set upon by a pride of lions. The old Gilgamesh, the arrogant tyrant, would have met them with a sneer. But this new Gilgamesh, hollowed out by sorrow, was gripped by fear. He looked up at the moon and prayed to the moon god Sin to protect him. His prayers seemed to give him strength. He raised his axe, fell upon the lions with a desperate fury, and scattered them, killing those who stood against him. He skinned them and wore their hides, adding another layer of wildness to his already savage appearance. His journey had begun with blood, a grim reminder that even in his quest to escape death, violence was his constant companion. His travels eventually brought him to the end of the mortal world, to the twin peaks of Mount Mashu, the mythical place that guarded the path of the sun. At the base of the mountain was a great gate, and standing before it were its guardians, a terrifying scorpion man and his wife. Their glory was awesome. Their glance was death itself, and the shimmering aura of their divinity reached to the heavens. When the scorpion man saw Gilgamesh, clad in lion skins and weathered by his journey, he turned to his wife. "This one who comes to us," he said, "his body is the flesh of the gods." His wife replied, "2/3 of him is God, but 1/3 is human." The scorpion man called out to Gilgamesh, his voice like the grinding of rock, demanding to know the reason for his impossible journey. Gilgamesh did not try to hide his purpose with boasts or lies. His grief had stripped him of all arrogance. He spoke from his heart, telling the divine guardians of his beloved friend Enkidu and how death had turned him to clay. "Because of my brother, I am afraid of death," Gilgamesh confessed, his voice breaking. "His fate now lies heavily upon me, and so I have journeyed here to find my ancestor, Utnapishtim, who stood in the assembly of the gods and was granted eternal life. I must ask him the secret of life and death." The journey of a hero is often a symbolic one, a passage through trials that represent a deeper spiritual transformation. Gilgamesh's path through the sun's tunnel is a classic example of this. It is a descent into the underworld, a symbolic death. By surviving the 12 leagues of absolute blackness, he is, in a sense, reborn, shedding his old identity and emerging into a new, divine space worthy of continuing his quest. The scorpion beings are the quintessential guardians of this threshold, supernatural sentinels who test the hero's resolve before allowing him to pass into the realm beyond. The scorpion man was moved by the king's raw sorrow, but he warned him of the path ahead. "No mortal has ever made this journey, Gilgamesh," he said. "The way is through the mountain for 12 leagues in utter and complete darkness. There is no light. You will not survive." But Gilgamesh's face was set with a resolve so absolute that it transcended fear. Seeing that he could not be dissuaded, the scorpion man sighed and with a gesture of pity opened the great gate of the mountain for him. "Go then, Gilgamesh," he said. "May the mountain pass allow you to travel safely." Gilgamesh plunged into the tunnel. The darkness was immediate and total. It was not just the absence of light. It was a thick, oppressive presence that smothered the senses. He could see nothing ahead, nothing behind. He walked on hour after hour, the wind of the tunnel rushing past his face. After 8 leagues, he cried out in terror, alone in the suffocating blackness, but he forced himself to continue. After 9 leagues, he felt the first touch of a north wind on his skin. After 11 leagues, he could sense a glimmer of light ahead, and at the end of the 12th league, he burst out of the tunnel, stumbling into the blinding, brilliant sunshine of a world he had never known. He found himself in a wondrous garden at the edge of a great sea. The trees here did not bear ordinary fruit. He saw bushes whose fruit were clusters of carnelian, vines whose grapes were beads of lapis lazuli. It was the garden of the gods, a divine paradise at the edge of the world. And walking through this impossible garden, he saw in the distance a tavern by the sea, and its lone keeper, the veiled alewife, Siduri. Gilgamesh, his body caked with the dust of the sun's tunnel, and his spirit still reeling from its darkness, stumbled through the jeweled garden. Ahead, by the shore of a vast and endless sea, he saw the tavern of Siduri, the divine alewife. But as he approached, Siduri looked out and saw not a king, but a figure of terror. She saw a man whose face was gaunt with grief, whose divine flesh was wasted away, and whose body was clad in the raw skins of wild lions. She mistook him for a murderer, a dangerous outcast from some forgotten land. In fear, she shot the bolt on her door, locked her gate, and climbed to the safety of her roof. Gilgamesh, seeing the door barred against him, felt a surge of his old anger. "Alewife," he shouted, his voice hoarse from his long journey, "what is it you see that makes you bar your door against me? If you do not open it, I will smash the bolt and shatter the gate." He then checked his anger, and his voice softened into the raw, honest plea that had become the mantra of his quest. He told her who he was, Gilgamesh, the king who had slain Humbaba and killed the bull of heaven. He explained that if he looked like a wild man, it was because his heart was filled with the sorrow of a wild man. "My friend, my younger brother," he cried out to the veiled woman on the roof, who hunted the wild ass and the panther, "he is now turned to clay. For 6 days and 7 nights I wept for him, and then I became afraid. The fate of my friend lies heavy upon me. How can I be still? How can I be silent? My friend whom I love is now dust, and shall I not also lie down like him and never rise again?" Hearing the profound grief in his voice, Siduri's fear melted away. She opened her door and let the wretched king enter. She listened to his story, and then she offered him a piece of wisdom, a philosophy that ran counter to his entire desperate journey. "Gilgamesh, where are you roaming?" she asked gently. "The life that you are searching for, you will never find. For when the gods created mankind, they allotted to him death, but life they retained in their own keeping." She urged him to abandon his mad quest. "As for you, Gilgamesh," she advised, "fill your belly with good things. Day and night, dance and be merry, feast and rejoice. Let your clothes be fresh and clean. Wash your head and bathe yourself in water. Cherish the little child that holds your hand, and make your wife happy in your embrace. For this, too, is the lot of mankind." This gentle wisdom, This call to find joy in the simple, beautiful, and finite pleasures of mortal life is one of the most profound moments in the epic. It is the wisdom of acceptance, of finding meaning not in eternity, but in the present moment, in community, and in love. It is the very answer Gilgamesh is seeking, but in his current state, consumed by terror, it is an answer he cannot possibly hear. He looked at the alewife with hollow eyes. Feasting on clean clothes, the love of a family, what were these things against the absolute blackness of eternal oblivion? "Tell me, Siduri," he said, his voice flat and obsessed, "which is the way to Utnapishtim? If it is possible, I will cross the sea. If it is not, I will roam the wilderness some more." Seeing that his resolve was unbreakable, Siduri sighed. The way, she told him, was all but impossible. He would have to cross the great ocean, and in its center lay the waters of death. A single touch of this water meant instant annihilation. But she told him there was one person who knew the way: Urshanabi, the ferryman of Utnapishtim. He lived in the forest nearby, where he guarded a mysterious set of objects known only as the stone things. Filled with a new, impatient energy, Gilgamesh stormed into the forest. He took his great axe in his hand, and when he came upon Urshanabi and the strange, sacred stone objects, he did not stop to ask questions. In a fit of blind rage, assuming them to be idols or obstacles, he raised his axe and smashed the stone things to pieces. A moment later, Urshanabi the ferryman confronted him. The look on his face was one of dismay. "Why have you done this?" he asked. The stone things, he explained, were the very objects that allowed the ferry to safely navigate the waters of death. By destroying them, Gilgamesh had destroyed his only means of a safe passage. The king's own impatience, his heroic tendency to solve every problem with force, had made his impossible journey even harder. "There is only one way now," Urshanabi told the crestfallen king. "Your own hands must not touch the deadly water. Go back into the forest. You must cut and prepare 300 punting poles, each one 60 cubits long. Coat them with bitumen. You will use each pole only once to push us through the waters of death, and then you must cast it away." And so Gilgamesh, the great king, was forced to perform the labor of a common woodsman, felling 300 trees to pay the price for his moment of rage. When the poles were finally ready, he and Urshanabi boarded the ferry and pushed out onto the great sea, leaving the wisdom of Siduri behind them and heading for the lethal heart of the ocean. The journey across the great sea was a race against death itself. Gilgamesh, standing at the prow of the ferry, took up the first of his 300 punting poles. He pushed it deep into the water, propelling them forward, and as his hands neared the surface, he cast the pole away just before it could touch the lethal waters. He took up the second pole and repeated the action, then the third. A grim, rhythmic procession of wood rose and fell as the king of Uruk single-handedly pushed the boat across the ocean. When the 300th pole was finally spent and cast into the sea, they were still not at the shore. In a final act of desperate strength, Gilgamesh stripped the animal skins from his body and held them up, using his own arms as a mast and the skins as a sail to catch the wind and carry them the final distance to the shores of Dilmun. Exhausted, he collapsed onto the beach of the faraway land. In the distance, he saw a figure. As he approached, The man looked up. He was old, but his posture was regal. He looked at Gilgamesh's gaunt face, his matted hair, and his wild clothing, and he asked the question that had followed the king across the world. Why are your cheeks so wasted, your face so haggard? Why is there such sorrow in your heart, and why do you look like one who has been on a long and desperate journey? For the last time, Gilgamesh told his story. He spoke of the glory of his friend Enkidu, of their adventures together, of his brother's slow and agonizing death, and of the profound terror that had seized him when he realized that the same fate awaited him. He explained his entire impossible journey, past the lions, through the scorpion gate, across the tunnel of darkness, and over the waters of death. He looked at the old man before him with raw, pleading eyes. I look at you, Utnapishtim, he said, and you are no different from me. You are a man, just as I am a man. Yet you have my desire. You have found eternal life. Tell me, how did you do it? How did you join the assembly of the gods and find a life that never ends? Utnapishtim, the man who had found life, looked at the king who was so desperate to escape death, and he sighed a deep, weary sigh. I will tell you a secret of the gods, Gilgamesh, he said, and he began to tell the story of the great flood. He had been a king, he explained, in the ancient city of Shuruppak, a city that grew old on the banks of the Euphrates. But the hearts of the great gods, led by the warrior Enlil, grew restless, and they decided in their secret council to destroy all of mankind with a flood. But the wise god Ea, who had sworn an oath with the others, felt pity. He came to the reed hut where Utnapishtim lived, and refusing to break his oath by speaking to a man, he spoke instead to the wall. Reed hut, wall, wall, he whispered. Dismantle your house and build a boat. Forsake possessions and save life. He gave Utnapishtim the precise dimensions for a colossal, 7-decked ark, which he built and sealed with bitumen. He loaded it with his family, his craftsmen, all his gold and silver, and the seed of every living thing. He described the terror of the storm that followed, a deluge so violent that even the gods cowered in fear, weeping at the destruction they had unleashed. For 6 days and 7 nights, the world was scoured clean. On the 7th day, the boat came to rest on the peak of Mount Nemish. He sent out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, which did not return, signaling that dry land had appeared. He disembarked and made a great sacrifice to the gods. The starving deities, he recounted with a hint of scorn, gathered like flies around the sweet-smelling smoke. When Enlil arrived, he was furious that any mortal had survived, but the wise Ea rebuked him for his disproportionate rage, arguing for a more measured punishment for mankind's sins. And then, Utnapishtim said, looking Gilgamesh directly in the eye, Enlil, his anger having cooled, came aboard my boat. He touched my forehead and the forehead of my wife, and he blessed us. He spoke the words of Enlil's decree. Hitherto, Utnapishtim has been but a man. Henceforth, he and his wife shall be like us gods. They shall live forever far away at the mouth of the rivers. Utnapishtim paused, letting the weight of his story settle on the exhausted king. The secret Gilgamesh had traveled the world to find was no secret at all. Utnapishtim's immortality was not earned. It was not the result of a quest, a ritual, or some hidden piece of wisdom. It was a unique, arbitrary, and unrepeatable gift from the gods following a cosmic catastrophe. There was no path to follow. There was no secret to learn. The entire premise of Gilgamesh's quest was, and always had been, a fantasy. Gilgamesh stood before Utnapishtim, the vast expanse of his journey, his suffering, and his hope collapsing into a single, devastating point. It was all for nothing. The king's spirit, which had survived the darkness of the earth and the waters of death, was finally broken. Utnapishtim, looking at the exhausted hero, decided to offer a final, simple proof of his mortal frailty. "Come, Gilgamesh," he said, not unkindly. "You who wish to conquer death, first you must conquer its younger brother, sleep. Just for now, do not lie down for 6 days and 7 nights." Brimming with a final flicker of his old pride, Gilgamesh accepted the challenge. He sat down, his back straight, determined to prove the immortal man wrong. But his quest had taken its toll. He had traveled to the ends of the earth, his body and spirit pushed beyond all human limits. The moment he sat down, as the text says, a mist of sleep, like a fog rolling in from the sea, breathed over him, and he fell instantly and completely asleep. Utnapishtim looked at the sleeping king with pity and turned to his wife. "Look at this strong man who wants to live forever," he said. "Sleep, like a storm cloud, has overwhelmed him." He wanted Gilgamesh to have undeniable proof of his failure, to prevent him from waking and claiming he had only dozed for a moment. "Bake a loaf of bread for him each day he sleeps," he instructed his wife. "Place it by his head and make a mark on the wall for every day that passes." His wife did as he asked, and as Gilgamesh slept, the row of loaves grew. The first was still fresh, the second was stale, the third was damp and turning moldy, the fourth was cracked and white, the fifth was covered in gray spores, the sixth was dark and ruined, and the seventh was hard as a stone. On the 7th day, Utnapishtim touched Gilgamesh, and the king awoke with a start. "I had hardly slept," he said, groggy and confused. "Sleep had barely touched me." But Utnapishtim simply pointed to the row of bread. "Look at your loaves, Gilgamesh," he said. "Count the marks on the wall. You have slept for 7 nights. Gilgamesh looked at the evidence of his own weakness, the decaying bread a perfect metaphor for his own mortal body, and he was crushed by a wave of despair. "What shall I do, Utnapishtim?" he cried. "Wherever I go, death, the snatcher, is waiting for me." He had failed the simplest of tests. He was mortal, through and through. Seeing his utter desolation, Utnapishtim instructed the ferryman Urshanabi to take the king away. "Take him to the washing place," he commanded. "Let him wash his long hair and cast away his filthy animal skins. Let him be clothed in fresh, royal robes, so he may return to his city in dignity." But as Gilgamesh prepared to board the ferry for the last time, his quest a total failure, Utnapishtim's wife took pity on him. "He came here on a long and weary journey," she whispered to her husband. "Will you not give him something to take back with him?" Utnapishtim, moved by his wife's compassion, called the king back one last time. "Gilgamesh," he said, "I will tell you a hidden thing, a secret of the gods." He told him of a plant, a marvel of creation that grew on the floor of the ocean. It had a thorn like a thistle that would prick the hand of anyone who tried to take it, but it held a miraculous power. It was not a plant of immortality, but a plant of rejuvenation. It was called "The Old Man Becomes a Young Man Again." If a person ate it, their youth would be restored. A new, more modest hope was kindled in Gilgamesh's heart. He would not live forever, but he could live his life again. He would take this plant back to his city, Uruk, and share it with the old men. He would give them back their strength, and then he too would eat it and return to the glory of his youth. Following Utnapishtim's instructions, he went to the shore, tied heavy stones to his feet to weigh him down, and sank into the deep waters of the Apsu. He found the plant, and though its thorns tore at his hands, he clutched it tightly and brought it to the surface, his prize secured. He boarded the ferry with Urshanabi, his spirit renewed. But on their long journey home, they stopped for the night beside a pool of cool, fresh water. Gilgamesh, wanting to wash the salt of the sea from his body, left the precious plant on the bank and stepped into the pool to bathe. As he did so, a serpent, drawn by the plant's sweet, irresistible fragrance, slithered silently from the water. It snatched the plant in its jaws and carried it away. And as it went, the snake shed its old skin, leaving it on the ground, instantly and visibly rejuvenated. Gilgamesh came out of the water to find his prize gone. He saw the snake's discarded skin, and he understood. He fell to the ground and wept, the tears streaming down his face. "For whom, Urshanabi, have my hands toiled?" he cried in utter despair. "For whom has my heart's blood been spent? I have gained nothing for myself. I have only done a favor for the lion of the earth." Even this last small hope had been stolen from him at the final moment, not by a god or a monster, but by a simple snake and his own moment of carelessness. Empty-handed and hollowed out by his final failure, Gilgamesh continued his journey home with the ferryman Urshanabi. All his toil, all his suffering, had brought him no closer to eternal life. He had nothing to show for his quest but the deep lines of sorrow on his face and the weary weight of his own mortality in his heart. As they approached the great city of Uruk, the walls that he had built in his arrogant youth rose up from the plain to meet them, and in that moment, something profound shifted within the grieving king. He stopped, and he turned to the ferryman. His voice was no longer filled with the fire of a hero or the despair of a failed god, but with the quiet, steady pride of a builder, a king who finally understood his true purpose. "Go up, Urshanabi," he said, "and walk upon the walls of Uruk. Inspect the foundation terrace and examine the brickwork. See how it is not of burnt brick, and how the 7 sages themselves laid its foundations." He spoke not of his own strength, nor of the monsters he had slain. He spoke of the enduring quality of the work, the greatness of the city that would outlive him. He pointed out the temple of Ishtar, the storehouses, the whole ordered expanse of civilization. In that moment, Gilgamesh finally grasped the only immortality a mortal can ever achieve. It was not to be found in a magical plant or a divine secret at the edge of the world. It was here, in the lasting work of one's hands, in the legacy left for the community, in the great walls that would protect future generations long after his own body had turned to clay. His quest had been a failure, but in that failure he had found a deeper wisdom. This acceptance of his earthly legacy was all the more profound given what he and his entire culture believed awaited him after death. The final destination was not a place of rest or reward. The soul, or a temu, of a dead person undertook a journey downward to the great below, a grim and shadowy kingdom known as Kur or Irkala. This was the land of no return, the house of dust, the place Enkidu had seen in his final, terrifying vision. It was a city of eternal twilight, whose inhabitants were clothed like birds with a garment of feathers, a place where they saw no light and lived in blackness. The food in the underworld was clay, and the drink was dusty water. This was not a hell reserved for sinners. It was the great, gray, and democratic destination for everyone. Kings who had worn crowns and feasted in palaces now sat in the dust, reduced to servants. Priests who had commanded the attention of the gods were now silent shades. All earthly status was erased at the gates of the underworld, where the grim and absolute queen, Ereshkigal, ruled from her lapis lazuli throne. Her scribe, Belet Seri, knelt before her, reading from the great clay tablet that listed the name of every soul who entered, their fate permanently recorded and sealed. There was no escape. This deeply pessimistic view of the afterlife profoundly shaped Mesopotamian life. With no promise of paradise, the focus was intensely on the here and now, on achieving great deeds, building great works, and most importantly, on having children. A person's comfort in the dreary afterlife was thought to depend directly on the care they received from their living descendants. Families were obligated to perform a ritual called the kispu, a regular offering of food and water to their dead ancestors. It was believed that without these offerings, a spirit would become a hungry, thirsty, and malevolent ghost, a gidam who could slip out from the underworld to haunt the living, bringing sickness and misfortune. A good life, therefore, meant ensuring you would be remembered and cared for by the next generation. It was a powerful bond that tied the living and the dead together in a web of mutual, unending obligation. And these unhappy ghosts were far from the only supernatural threat that stalked the ancient world. They were but one small part of a vast and terrifying population of demons, spirits, and monsters that lurked just beyond the firelight. The world Gilgamesh returned to, the world of any Mesopotamian, was not an empty stage upon which human dramas played out. It was a place that was alive, humming with the presence of the unseen. The great gods like Anu, Enlil, and even the fearsome Ishtar were often distant, their concerns focused on the grand, cosmic order of things. The reality of daily life, however, was a constant and careful negotiation with a vast and bewildering population of spirits, ghosts, and demons who lurked in the shadows of the mundane world. A doorway, a heap of ruins, the shimmering heat of the midday sun, the quiet of the empty desert, all of these could be the dwelling place of a supernatural power, and most of them were, at best, indifferent to human affairs, and at worst, actively hostile. The most familiar of these spirits were the unhappy ghosts, the gidam, the restless souls of the dead who had been forgotten by their families. These were pitiable creatures, driven by hunger and thirst to torment the living, but they were at least human in origin. Far more terrifying were the demons, the udug, who had never been human at all. These were primordial beings, manifestations of the world's inherent chaos, who could act as the agents of a god's wrath, or simply as freelance forces of misery. They were the cause of sickness, of misfortune, of the sudden and inexplicable pains that could strike a person down. Among this host of horrors, two figures stood out, their names whispered in fear for thousands of years. The first was the dreadful goddess Damoness, Lamashtu. She was a creature of pure nightmare, a monstrous hybrid with the head of a lioness, the teeth of a donkey, the talons of an eagle, and a hairy, bestial body. She was often depicted kneeling on a donkey, suckling a pig and a dog at her bare breasts, with venomous snakes clutched in her hands. Her specific evil, the terror she embodied, was one of the greatest fears of the ancient world, the death of infants and their mothers. Lamashtu was the child snatcher. She was said to creep into the houses of pregnant women to cause miscarriages and into the rooms of new mothers to kidnap their babies as they slept. She would gnaw on their bones, drink their blood, and poison their mother's milk. In a world with tragically high rates of infant and maternal mortality, Lamashtu was not a myth. She was the terrifying personal explanation for an all too common reality. The second great terror was Pazuzu, a being just as monstrous as Lamashtu, and in a strange and fascinating twist, her greatest enemy. Pazuzu was the personification of the harsh southwest wind that blew in from the desert, bringing drought in the summer and locusts in the winter. His appearance was unforgettable, a man's body covered in scales, the head of a snarling lion or dog, the talons of an eagle, 4 great wings, and a scorpion's tail. He was a demon of plague and famine, a being of immense destructive power. And yet, the Mesopotamians, in a remarkable display of magical pragmatism, turned this terrifying demon into their greatest protector against Lamashtu. This paradoxical relationship is a deep insight into the Mesopotamian magical worldview. They believed that only a power of equal or greater magnitude could defeat another. While the great gods might be unwilling to intervene in such earthly matters, the king of the evil wind demons could be turned against the child-snatching demoness. And so, in a classic example of fighting fire with fire, people would hang protective amulets in their homes, especially in the rooms of pregnant women and newborns, that bore the horrifying face of Pazuzu. The logic was simple. When Lamashtu crept into the room to attack the child, she would see the face of her great rival, Pazuzu, and flee in terror. The image of one great evil was used as a supernatural scarecrow to ward off another. These were just 2 of the most famous terrors. The world was also haunted by the Lilitu, female demons who seduced men in their sleep, a distant ancestor of the later legend of Lilith. And of course, there were the Gala, the grim sheriffs of the underworld who had dragged Dumuzid to his fate, beings who could not be swayed by offerings, and whose only purpose was to seize the souls of the living. This constant threat of demonic influence meant that life was a perpetual state of spiritual vigilance. It was not enough to simply pray to the great gods in their temples. One had to fight this daily war against the unseen, and this battle was not fought with faith alone, but with a complex and deeply ingrained system of magic, of rituals, and of constant attempts to read the future in the signs the gods left hidden all around them.